My name is Savannah, 33 years old, and at my father's retirement party, he thought it would be funny to introduce me to his wealthy colleagues by saying, "This is my daughter, no degree, no future, just freeloads off the family." Everyone laughed. I did not flinch. I just smiled, walked up to the microphone and said, "Cheers. This is the last time any of you will see me." Then I walked out, leaving the room in dead silence. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The Crystal Ballroom at the Oak Ridge Country Club in Chicago was dripping with old money and forced laughter. I stood quietly near the back doors, wearing a simple black dress that allowed me to blend seamlessly into the shadows. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated the room with trays of expensive champagne and delicate appetizers. The soft hum of a string quartet playing in the corner was nearly drowned out by the clinking of crystal glasses and the loud, boastful conversations of the city's financial elite. At the front of the room, standing on a raised wooden stage, my father Richard was holding court. At 62 years old, he looked exactly as he always did, wearing a custom-tailored suit, a silk tie, and a practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was a senior wealth manager at a highly prestigious firm, and tonight was his grand retirement celebration. His company had just been acquired by a massive faceless Wall Street private equity firm, and he was expecting a golden parachute worth $10 million to carry him into a luxurious retirement. Beside him on the stage stood my older brother, Cameron. At 36, Cameron was the undisputed golden child of our family. He wore an expensive velvet blazer and smiled with a smug sense of entitlement as our father threw a heavy arm around his shoulders. Growing up, the dynamic in our house was painfully clear. Cameron could do no wrong, and I could do no right. While I scrubbed floors and tutored other students to earn my own spending money, Cameron was handed the keys to brand new luxury cars and given unlimited access to our parents' credit cards. Even as adults, nothing changed. Cameron was currently running his third tech startup. The first two had failed spectacularly, burning through hundreds of thousands of dollars of our parents' money, but they never stopped treating him like a genius. Richard tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon, demanding the attention of the 200 elite guests. The massive ballroom hushed immediately. My mother Patricia stood near the front row of tables. Her posture was rigid, her pearls gleaming under the massive crystal chandeliers. She beamed with overwhelming pride as Richard began to speak. He talked extensively about his decades of building wealth, his unmatched dedication to his firm, and the powerful legacy he was leaving behind. Then he turned his attention to Cameron. He called my brother a tech visionary, praising his latest startup venture and boasting to the crowd of investors about how Cameron was destined to change the global financial landscape. Everyone clapped politely. No one in that room knew the truth. No one knew that Cameron's startup was currently drowning in debt, or that his supposedly visionary ideas were entirely stolen from brilliant developers he had recently fired to avoid paying them their equity. They just saw the perfect successful son my parents desperately wanted everyone to see. Then my father's gaze swept across the crowded room and landed directly on me. I had not been formally invited to this event. I only found out about it because I received a generic email forward from my mother's assistant treating me like an afterthought. But I came anyway because I knew exactly what was about to happen with his firm. Richard smirked, holding his microphone a little closer to his mouth. A cruel glint flashed in his eyes. And of course, he announced, his voice booming over the large speakers, "We have my daughter Savannah hiding in the back. Let us give a round of applause for Savannah. No degree, no career, no future. She just freeloads off the family name while she tries to figure herself out. Let us hope some of Cameron's ambition rubs off on her tonight." A loud ripple of laughter echoed through the ballroom. 200 wealthy executives, socialites, and family friends turned in their plush chairs to look at me. I felt the heavy weight of their judgment, their condescending pity, and their blatant amusement. I looked at my mother, Patricia, who caught my eye from across the room. She did not look sympathetic or protective. Instead, she walked briskly over to me, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She grabbed my arm tightly, her manicured fingers digging painfully into my skin. "Stop embarrassing us," she hissed under her breath, her face twisting with disdain. "Go wait in the car out back until we are finished here. You are ruining your father's big night with your miserable attitude." I looked down at my mother's angry face and then back up at my father, who was still chuckling on stage with Cameron. 13 years ago, their public mockery and cruel laughter might have broken me. 13 years ago, I was a 20-year-old college sophomore with straight grades, dreaming of building a career in corporate finance. That was before I walked into the university registrar's office to pay for my next semester and found out my tuition account was completely empty. That was before I discovered the devastating truth that my father had secretly drained my entire college fund, every single penny I had saved, and that my grandparents had left me to pay off Cameron's massive underground gambling debts. My father had stolen my future to keep his golden boy out of jail. When I confronted them in our living room back then, heartbroken and betrayed, my father told me I was ungrateful. He told me that girls did not really need degrees anyway, and that family loyalty meant protecting Cameron. When I demanded my money back, they threw me out of the house. They handed me exactly $200 and told me to figure life out on my own. I did not go to the car to wait. I gently but firmly pulled my arm out of my mother's tight grip. I walked right past her, ignoring her shocked, indignant gasp, and made my way straight down the center aisle toward the brightly lit stage. The laughter in the room began to die down quickly, replaced by confused whispers and shifting chairs. Richard frowned as I climbed the short wooden steps to the stage. "What do you think you are doing?" he muttered through gritted teeth, stepping forward to block the microphone. I simply smiled, stepped gracefully around him, and tapped the microphone. The sharp, echoing sound cut through the silent ballroom. I raised an empty champagne flute I had grabbed from a passing waiter's tray. "I would like to propose a quick toast to the man of the hour," I said, my voice projecting steady and clear across the vast room. "Cheers to Richard, the man who secretly drained my college tuition fund when I was 20 years old to pay off his golden son's illegal gambling debts." A collective audible gasp rippled through the wealthy crowd. Cameron went completely pale, his eyes widening in panic as he took a quick step back. Richard's jaw dropped, his face turning an angry mottled shade of red. He reached out to grab the microphone stand, but I stepped out of his reach. I was not finished. I looked directly at the wealthy investors, the managing partners, and the executives sitting in the front row. "And cheers to the great family legacy," I continued. "The legacy of kicking a 20-year-old girl out onto the street because she dared to ask why her education and her future were sacrificed to cover up a felony. You called me uneducated tonight, Dad. You proudly told this room that I have no future. But it turns out that dropping out of college gave me a lot of free time to learn exactly how the real world works." I set the crystal glass down hard on the wooden podium. "Enjoy your retirement party. This is the last time any of you will see me." I let the microphone drop. It hit the stage floor with a loud, heavy thud. The entire ballroom was paralyzed in stunned, absolute silence. No one moved to stop me. No one spoke a single word. My mother stood frozen near the back doors, her face completely drained of color. Cameron looked like he was going to be physically sick right there on the stage. Richard was completely speechless, his carefully constructed public image of the perfect family man shattered into a million pieces in less than 60 seconds. I walked down the center aisle, keeping my head held high, my posture perfectly straight. I pushed through the heavy oak doors of the country club and stepped out into the cool, refreshing evening air. A sleek black chauffeur-driven Maybach was waiting for me at the curb. My driver immediately opened the door, and I slid into the luxurious leather back seat. The moment the heavy door closed, blocking out the country club and the toxic family I was leaving behind forever, my cell phone rang. It was David, my chief operating officer. I accepted the call, leaning back against the plush seat. "Savannah," David said, his voice crisp and professional. "The hostile takeover of your father's firm is officially complete. The board just signed the final paperwork 5 minutes ago. Vanguard Acquisitions now owns 100% of their assets, properties, and client portfolios. I looked out the tinted window, watching the valet drivers rush around the brightly lit country club entrance. Excellent work, David, I replied, a deep sense of satisfaction washing over me. What is the status of the executive payouts? We have the authorization request for Richard's retirement package right here on my desk, David explained. The golden parachute is set at $10 million standard for a senior wealth manager of his tenure under the old company policy. Do we have your signature as the new chief executive officer to authorize the transfer to his personal accounts? I smiled, a cold, highly calculated smile that had taken me 13 years of blood, sweat, and relentless ambition to perfect. Freeze it, I said softly. Freeze the entire $10 million immediately. And David initiate a full forensic audit on his specific department first thing tomorrow morning. Let us see exactly how my father has been managing his clients' wealth all these years. 3 days later, the violent pounding on my front door rattled the hinges. I did not even have to look through the peephole to know who was standing on the other side. My modest 2-bedroom apartment in the city was a carefully maintained illusion, a humble space I kept specifically to ensure my family never suspected the actual scope of my wealth. I unlocked the deadbolt, and before I could even turn the handle, the door was shoved open. My mother, Patricia, marched into my living room, her face flushed dark red with absolute fury. She was wearing her signature tennis whites, gripping her designer handbag like a weapon. Right behind her was Cameron, looking as arrogant as ever in his custom-tailored suit, his arms crossed over his chest as he surveyed my simple furniture with open disgust. "You vindictive, ungrateful little girl," Patricia hissed, slamming the door shut behind her. "How dare you humiliate your father in front of his colleagues? You made us the laughingstock of the entire country club." I walked calmly into the kitchen and poured myself a cup of black coffee. I did not humiliate him, Mom. He humiliated himself. I simply provided the audience with the accurate context of his parenting. Patricia let out a sharp, mocking laugh and threw a thick, folded stack of papers onto my cheap wooden dining table. It hit the surface with a heavy thud. "You want to talk about parenting, Savannah? You want to talk about taking responsibility? Here is your chance to finally contribute something useful to this family instead of just draining our energy." She jabbed a manicured finger at the stack of papers. "That is the outstanding bill for your grandfather's nursing home. $68,000 in arrears. The facility administrator called us yesterday and threatened to throw him out onto the street by Friday if the balance is not cleared immediately." I stared at the thick invoice, then took a slow sip of my coffee. "And why are you bringing this to me?" "Because your father and I are restructuring our assets for his retirement, and Cameron is currently tying up his capital in a major venture funding round." Patricia snapped, her voice dripping with entitlement. "We do not have the liquid cash to deal with this right now. You are going to go down to the bank today. You are going to take out a high-interest personal loan, and you are going to pay off this debt. You owe this family, Savannah. We put a roof over your head for 18 years. It is time you paid us back." Cameron smirked, leaning casually against my front door frame. "Come on, Savannah. You have been playing the misunderstood victim for over a decade. Time to step up. Take out the loan. You do not have any credit anyway, so it is not like a predatory interest rate is going to ruin your non-existent future." I walked over to the dining table. I did not yell, I did not cry. I calmly picked up the $68,000 invoice, folded it perfectly in half, and slid it right back across the table toward my mother. "I am not taking out a loan, Mom," I said, my voice steady and cold. "And neither of you need to worry about the nursing home evicting Grandpa." Patricia crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. "Excuse me, are you seriously refusing to help your own grandfather? The only man who ever tolerated your miserable attitude. If you do not pay this, he will be placed in a state-run ward by the weekend. Is that what you want?" I set my coffee mug down. "He is not going anywhere. I know that for a fact because I bought the entire Silver Pines nursing facility 14 months ago. I own the building, the operating license, and the medical contracts." Patricia froze. The angry color drained out of her cheeks in an instant. Cameron uncrossed his arms, standing up a little straighter as his confident smirk faltered. "You bought it!" Patricia stammered, her voice suddenly losing its venomous bite. "What are you talking about? You work temp jobs. You live in this pathetic little box." I ignored her insult and pulled a sleek manila folder from the island counter. I opened it and spread the official notarized documents across the dining table. "I own the facility," I repeated, "which means my financial team oversees all the billing and incoming payments, which also means I have complete unrestricted access to the facility's accounting ledgers." I watched my mother's eyes dart toward the door, a sudden sharp panic taking hold of her posture. For the last 10 years, I continued stepping closer to her grandpa's union pension, and his veterans' benefits were supposed to be directly routed to Silver Pines to cover his room and board. It was a guaranteed automatic payment system. But somehow those checks never arrived at the facility. Instead, they were diverted into a joint checking account under your name, Mom. Patricia took a quick step back, bumping into the edge of the sofa. "That is a lie. You do not know what you are talking about. I was managing his care. I was handling his expenses. You were handling your country club membership fees," I corrected her, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. "You were handling your spa retreats, your designer wardrobe, and Cameron's endless string of failed startup expenses. You stole roughly $4,000 a month from a defenseless old man who could barely remember his own name, leaving his actual care facility, bills unpaid, while you lived like royalty. You committed elder financial abuse for a decade." "That is an absurd accusation," Cameron interjected, trying to sound authoritative, though his voice wavered. "You cannot prove any of that. You are just trying to deflect from the fact that you are a broke, bitter dropout holding a grudge." I turned my gaze to my brother. "I do not have to prove it to you, Cameron. I proved it to a federal judge at 8 o'clock this morning." I tapped the top document on the table. "This is a court order. I filed an emergency petition for full legal and financial guardianship over Grandpa, presenting the complete forensic audit of Mom's checking accounts as evidence. The judge granted my petition immediately. Mom has been stripped of all her power of attorney rights." Patricia let out a sharp gasp, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. "You had no right. He is my father. And he was my grandfather, the only person in this family who actually treated me like a human being." I fired back the years of suppressed rage, finally bleeding into my words. "You left him to rot in that facility while you drained his life savings. He is under my sole protection now. And the facility administrators have already been instructed to forward your fraudulent billing history to the state prosecutor's office." My mother began to hyperventilate, her manicured hands trembling violently as she realized the inescapable legal trap she had just walked into. She looked at Cameron, desperate for him to fix the situation, to exert his usual golden child dominance and make the consequences disappear. Cameron puffed out his chest, stepping squarely between me and our mother. He desperately tried to project the image of a powerful tech CEO, refusing to be intimidated by the sister he had spent his entire life looking down upon. "You think you are so smart, Savannah," he sneered, pointing a finger directly at my face. "You think printing out some fake documents and spinning a few lies makes you a player in the real world? You are nothing. You are a failed, uneducated nobody living in a cheap, rundown apartment. You want to play hardball with the big boys. Fine." He pulled out his cell phone, waving it at me like a weapon. "I know the owner of this apartment building. We play golf at the same club. I am going to call him right now and tell him you are running illegal business operations out of this unit. I will tell him you are unstable and a massive liability. I will have my connections get you slapped with a 3-day eviction notice so fast your head will spin. You will be out on the street with your trash bags before the weekend, exactly where you belong." I watched him unlock his phone, his thumb hovering over his contacts list. The sheer blinding arrogance of his threat was almost beautiful. He was so completely detached from reality, so entirely convinced of his own untouchable superiority, that he could not see the massive concrete wall rushing toward him. "Call him," I challenged gently. Cameron scoffed. "Do not test me, Savannah. I will have you thrown out like garbage." I reached into the front pocket of my designer tote bag sitting on the kitchen counter. I let my fingers wrap around the cold, heavy metal of the object inside. I slowly pulled it out and tossed it onto the wooden dining table, right next to the guardianship papers. It was a heavy, solid brass master keycard. Stamped onto the front of the brass plate in bold, elegant lettering was the logo for Vanguard Acquisition's real estate division. Cameron stopped. His eyes flicked down to the heavy brass keycard, his thumb freezing above his phone screen. "You cannot evict the owner of the building, Cameron," I said, my voice cutting through the silence of the apartment like a razor blade. "I bought this entire residential complex 3 years ago. I kept this modest unit for myself, specifically because it was quiet, and because I knew snobs like you and Mom would never bother coming to this part of town, unless you wanted something from me." Cameron swallowed hard. His eyes locked on the Vanguard Acquisitions logo. He knew that name. Every desperate tech founder in the city knew that name. But while "you cannot evict me," I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "I can absolutely evict you." Cameron forced a rigid, condescending laugh, though his face was slick with sudden sweat. "You are bluffing. You do not have the power to evict me from anywhere. My tech company operates out of the prime financial district. We occupy a premium Class A commercial suite. You cannot touch me." I smiled, letting the absolute certainty of his impending destruction wash over me. Yes, the premium commercial suite on the 42nd floor of the downtown high-rise. The suite you leased 2 years ago when you convinced Dad to give you another massive cash injection. But unfortunately for you, big brother, you missed your rent payment last month. And the month before that. In fact, your failing tech company is currently 90 days past due on its commercial lease. Cameron's jaw tightened. "How do you know that?" "Because your commercial lease is held by Vanguard Acquisitions," I said, watching the realization hit him like a physical blow. "When I authorized the hostile takeover of Dad's firm, my real estate group also absorbed all of the outstanding commercial properties in that portfolio. Your failing little startup just defaulted on its office lease, a lease held by my company. I own your building, Cameron, and your grace period expired at midnight." My brother stood entirely paralyzed in the center of my living room, the phone slipping from his grasp and landing with a dull thud on the carpet. The heavy silence in my living room was shattered only by the sound of the rain beating relentlessly against the large glass windows of my apartment. Cameron stared at the heavy brass keycard bearing the Vanguard Acquisitions logo, as if it were a venomous snake ready to strike. His face transitioned rapidly from a state of paralyzed shock to a deep, ugly shade of crimson red. He shook his head violently, refusing to accept the reality sitting right in front of him on the dining table. "You are lying. You are a delusional, uneducated liar." Cameron stepped closer to the dining table, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "You really expect me to believe that a college dropout who could not even afford rent a few years ago suddenly owns a massive commercial real estate portfolio? You probably stole that keycard from some executive at your little temp job. You printed these fake papers out to scare me because you are pathetic and jealous." He lunged across the wooden table, reaching aggressively for the lease default documents I had laid out. He intended to tear them up, to physically destroy the evidence of his own failure and reclaim his sense of superiority. But his hands never reached the paper. The door to my adjoining home office opened with a swift, fluid motion. Marcus, my private security contractor, stepped into the living room. Marcus was a former military police officer who had been quietly reviewing building security protocols in the other room. He moved with terrifying speed and absolute precision. Before Cameron could even register the movement, Marcus grabbed my brother by the lapels of his custom velvet suit and shoved him forcefully backward. Cameron stumbled over the edge of the living room rug and crashed hard into the armchair, gasping for air as Marcus stepped between us, forming an impenetrable human wall. My mother completely lost whatever fragile composure she had left. She began shrieking, her voice echoing shrilly off the apartment walls. "How dare you!" she screamed, rushing forward to grab Cameron by the arm and pull him up from the chair. How dare you have hired muscle assault your own brother in this cheap little hovel? You are an ungrateful, wretched girl. We are your family. After everything we have done for you, after everything we sacrificed to give you a good life, this is how you repay us. You threaten us with fake documents and violent thugs. I calmly picked up the commercial eviction notice bearing Cameron's tech company name. I stepped around the dining table, walking right up to the edge of the space Marcus was holding. I looked directly into my mother's furious, panicked eyes. Everything you have done for me? I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet, but completely steady. Let us talk exactly about what you did for me, Mom. I held the eviction notice up so Cameron could clearly see the red default stamp across his business name. 13 years ago, I stood in our grand foyer in tears begging you and Dad to explain why my college tuition fund was completely gone. I begged you to help me stay in school so I could finish my finance degree. Instead, you looked me in the eye and told me that Cameron needed the money to cover his underground sports betting debts, because his reputation in your social circle was more important than my entire education. When I told you I was going to report the theft to the police, you packed my belongings in black plastic trash bags and threw them down the front steps of the house. My mother opened her mouth to interrupt, but I stepped closer, forcing her to step back. You stood on the porch in your expensive cashmere sweater. I continued, my words striking like physical blows. You handed me exactly 2 crisp $100 bills. You told me I was a selfish burden to the family, and you locked the deadbolt. It was pouring rain that night, too. I was 20 years old, completely alone and terrified out of my mind. I slept in a booth at a 24-hour diner until the manager threatened to call the police and have me arrested for loitering. I built my entire empire from those $200 while you and Dad continued to blindly fund Cameron's spectacular failures. So do not ever stand in my building and talk to me about sacrifice or gratitude. Cameron pushed past my mother, trying to regain his footing. This is insane. You cannot evict my company. We have investor meetings next week. We have servers full of proprietary code in that office suite. If you lock us out, the investors will pull their funding and the company will go under. The company is already under, Cameron, I said, staring at him with absolute indifference. You just refuse to admit it. Vanguard Acquisitions has officially seized the premises. Your access badges were deactivated 10 minutes ago, and my property managers are currently inventorying your office equipment to cover the unpaid rent. My mother opened her mouth to argue, to spin another web of toxic gaslighting and demand that I fix the situation, but no words came out. She finally realized that the obedient, desperate daughter she had abused for decades was truly gone. I turned to Marcus. Escort them off my property immediately, I ordered. If they resist, call the local precinct and press charges for trespassing and attempted assault. Marcus nodded once. He stepped forward, placing a firm, unyielding hand on Cameron's shoulder and another on my mother's arm. It is time to leave, he stated in a deep voice that left absolutely no room for negotiation. Cameron tried to shake off the grip, but Marcus simply applied a fraction more pressure, forcing my brother to wince in pain and comply. They were marched out of my apartment door and down the long, brightly lit hallway. I followed a few paces behind, watching the people who had tormented me my entire life being forcibly removed from my presence. We rode the private executive elevator down to the main lobby in total silence. The heavy tension in the small space was suffocating, but I had never felt lighter. The building concierge looked up in surprise from his mahogany desk as Marcus guided my struggling mother and my red-faced brother across the polished marble floor. Cameron was muttering desperate legal threats under his breath, but he did not dare raise his voice or make another physical move against the security contractor. Marcus pushed open the heavy glass double doors at the front entrance and guided them outside onto the pavement. The Chicago weather was absolutely miserable. A freezing torrential downpour was flooding the streets, and the wind was howling aggressively between the high-rise buildings. Marcus stepped back inside the lobby, letting the heavy glass doors swing shut with a final decisive click. He stood dutifully by the entrance, leaving my mother and brother standing completely exposed to the violent storm. Patricia shrieked as the freezing rain immediately soaked her expensive designer coat and ruined her perfectly styled hair. She stood on the wet concrete sidewalk, wiping the heavy rain from her face with a shaking hand. She glared at me through the thick glass doors, her expression twisted with pure venomous hatred and wounded pride. "Enjoy your pathetic little power trip, Savannah!" she yelled, her voice barely carrying through the thick, reinforced glass and the deafening sound of the pouring rain. "Enjoy it while it lasts. Your father receives his $10 million severance package directly from the new parent company tomorrow morning. When that money clears, we are going to buy this entire miserable block. We are going to bulldoze this building to the ground and leave you with absolutely nothing all over again." I stood in the warm, dry lobby of the luxury building I owned, surrounded by staff who respected me and security that protected me. I watched my mother shivering in the cold, completely oblivious to the reality of her situation. I simply placed my hands in the pockets of my trousers and smiled a slow, genuine smile. Patricia and Cameron turned and ran down the flooded sidewalk, desperately searching the empty street for a taxi to take them away. They had absolutely no idea who the chief executive officer of that new parent company actually was. The morning sun reflected harshly off the towering glass facade of Vanguard Acquisitions, a massive skyscraper that dominated the center of the Chicago financial district. Cameron pushed through the heavy revolving doors, his expensive leather shoes squeaking slightly on the pristine, polished marble floor. He had spent the entire night sleeping on his mother's cramped velvet sofa, furiously reviewing his pitch deck after being thrown out into the freezing rain. He was exhausted, cornered, and deeply in debt, but this morning he wore a fresh, custom-tailored suit and his trademark mask of unearned, blinding confidence. He approached the sleek, minimalist reception desk, completely ignoring the line of waiting professionals who had appointments. He pushed his way to the front and slammed his expensive leather briefcase onto the white quartz counter. He glared down at the receptionist, treating her with the same casual disdain he reserved for anyone he considered beneath him. "I am Cameron," he announced, his voice loud enough to turn heads in the busy lobby. "I have an exclusive closed-door meeting with your chief executive officer. Tell them I am here right now, and tell them to cancel their next appointment because my presentation is going to take a while." The receptionist, a highly poised young woman in a sharp gray suit, did not flinch at his aggressive tone. She calmly typed his name into her terminal, her eyes scanning the screen. "You do not have an appointment on the schedule today, sir." Cameron scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes as if he were dealing with an incompetent child. "Listen to me very closely. Vanguard approached my startup last month. I am bringing your boss a highly lucrative buyout opportunity. Your top executive has been keeping their identity completely anonymous, which tells me they are hungry for a discreet, high-level acquisition. I am the son of Richard, a senior wealth manager whose firm Vanguard just acquired yesterday. I am practically financial royalty in this building. Pick up the phone and do your job before I have you fired." The receptionist met his arrogant glare with absolute, unwavering calm. She pressed a silver button on her discreet earpiece. "Yes, he is making a scene in the lobby right now," she said quietly. She listened for a moment, nodded, and looked back up at Cameron. "Executive floor. Boardroom A. Security will escort you up." Cameron smirked aggressively, straightening his silk tie. "That is exactly what I thought. Learn your place." Two towering security guards in dark suits stepped out from behind the elevator banks. They flanked Cameron, their expressions entirely unreadable, as they guided him into a private, glass-walled executive elevator. As the cab shot upward, Cameron looked out over the sprawling Chicago skyline. He felt the familiar, intoxicating rush of superiority returning to his veins. Last night had been a humiliating fluke. Savannah getting her hands on a little real estate was just a lucky break, a temporary anomaly that he could easily squash once he secured this massive buyout. He needed this cash injection today. His tech startup was bleeding money, his developers had all quit, and his current investors were growing dangerously suspicious of his empty promises. But Vanguard Acquisitions had bottomless pockets. Vanguard was exactly the kind of ruthless, aggressive private equity firm that bought up failing tech companies just to strip them for parts and claim the intellectual property. Cameron tightened his grip on the handle of his briefcase. He had the stolen source code on a flash drive. He had the fake financial projections printed in glossy folders. He just needed to charm this anonymous CEO, secure a $5 million buyout check, and walk away completely clean. Then his father would receive his $10 million severance package tomorrow morning, and they would pool their funds to absolutely crush Savannah. They would buy her little apartment building and evict her just as Patricia had promised in the rain. The elevator chimed softly. The heavy steel doors slid open to reveal the opulent executive floor of Vanguard Acquisitions. The security guards pointed silently toward a set of massive frosted glass doors at the very end of a long, quiet corridor. Cameron strutted forward, his ego inflating with every single step. He pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped confidently into the most intimidating boardroom he had ever seen. The room was massive, dominated by a 40-foot conference table carved from a single piece of dark polished walnut. State-of-the-art presentation screens lined the walls, casting a cool blue glow over the space. At the far end of the long table, facing the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the busy city, sat a high-backed black leather executive chair. The CEO was already seated, their back turned completely to the room, silently observing the morning traffic hundreds of feet below. Cameron did not wait for an invitation to speak. He walked straight to the head of the table, snapped open his briefcase, and pulled out a silver laser pointer. He plugged a small flash drive into the table console, projecting his stolen pitch deck onto the massive screen behind him. "Let us skip the corporate pleasantries," Cameron began, pacing confidently back and forth in front of the screen. "I know exactly how private equity works. You buy, you gut, you profit. You have been keeping your name off the press releases because you want to move quietly in the shadows. I respect that. I operate the exact same way. I am here to offer you the exclusive source code to a revolutionary financial algorithm. My current company is practically gift-wrapped for an immediate acquisition." The leather chair did not move. The anonymous executive remained perfectly still, listening in total silence. Cameron took this silence as an invitation to boast. He wanted to sound like a ruthless shark. He wanted this anonymous billionaire to see him as an equal peer. So he leaned heavily into his own arrogance, completely unaware of the legal trap he was actively walking into. "To be perfectly honest with you, my current investors are complete idiots." Cameron laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed off the boardroom walls. "They think we are hitting our quarterly targets. They have absolutely no idea the business is running on fumes. I have massive corporate debt hidden in offshore holding accounts, and an independent financial audit is scheduled for next Thursday. If those investors see the real books, I am going to federal prison for wire fraud." He paused, leaning casually against the expensive wooden table, crossing his ankles. "I need a buyout today," he demanded. "You write me a check for $5 million, you absorb the hidden debt, and you get exclusive rights to a platform that will generate $50 million by next year." I fired my entire lead development team right before the launch so I would not have to pay out their equity shares. They wrote the program, but I stole the code. I own it outright. It is a completely clean handover. We both win, and my clueless investors take the fall. Cameron clicked his laser pointer, highlighting a heavily manipulated graph on the projection screen. The bright red beam danced across the fake inflated numbers. He was sweating now, the adrenaline of his own desperate lies pushing him forward. He slammed his hand flat on the walnut table, trying to project absolute dominance over the silent room. "I am offering you a gold mine," Cameron stated, his voice ringing with forced authority. "But this offer is only on the table for the next 10 minutes. My father is Richard, a senior executive whose wealth management firm you just bought yesterday. He is receiving a $10 million payout tomorrow. If you do not buy my company right now, he is going to fund me himself, and I will take this groundbreaking technology to your biggest competitor. We will run you out of Chicago. Do we have a deal, or am I walking out that door right now?" The heavy silence in the boardroom was absolutely deafening. The only sound was the faint, steady hum of the building's air conditioning system. The high-backed leather chair remained perfectly still, facing the bright window. Then very slowly the chair began to rotate. The smooth mechanical whir of the swivel base echoed loudly in the massive room. Cameron stood tall, tightly gripping his silver laser pointer, a smug, victorious smile plastered across his face. He adjusted his suit jacket, ready to shake hands with a ruthless corporate titan. The chair spun completely around. Savannah sat there. She was wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored charcoal executive suit, her hands resting calmly on the leather armrests. She looked at him with eyes as cold and hard as cut diamonds. She did not say a single word. She just sat in the CEO's chair and watched him. Cameron stopped breathing. The smug, arrogant smile slid off his face in an instant, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The color drained from his cheeks so fast, he looked like a ghost. His eyes bulged, darting wildly around the empty boardroom as his brain failed to process the impossible reality sitting right in front of him. His fingers went entirely numb. The silver laser pointer slipped from his loose grasp, hitting the solid walnut table with a loud, sharp crack before clattering onto the floor. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the massive executive boardroom was the faint clatter of Cameron's silver laser pointer rolling across the polished hardwood floor. He stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled out of water. The sheer impossibility of the situation was short-circuiting his brain. He looked around the room, expecting someone to jump out and declare this all a massive, elaborate prank. He looked at the silent board members sitting along the edges of the 40-foot walnut table. None of them moved. None of them offered him a lifeline. They just watched him with the cold, calculating eyes of apex predators. Cameron forced a sharp, unnatural bark of laughter. He ran a trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair and shook his head. "Okay, very funny," he said, his voice cracking slightly before he tried to inject it with his usual booming arrogance. "Very funny, Savannah. I do not know who let you up here or how much you paid the receptionist to pull off this little stunt, but the joke is over. Get out of the chair." I did not move a single muscle. I kept my hands folded neatly on the leather desk pad in front of me. "I am serious, Savannah," Cameron snapped, taking a threatening step forward, though his legs looked unsteady. "You are trespassing in a highly secure corporate facility. The real chief executive officer is going to walk through those doors any second, and when they do, I am personally going to make sure you are arrested for corporate espionage. Now get out of the chair before I call security and have you dragged out of here in handcuffs." I tilted my head, studying the desperate, frantic panic bleeding through his false bravado. I reached under the heavy lip of my desk and pressed a small silver button. A heavy mechanical thud echoed through the room as the electronic deadbolts on the massive frosted glass doors slammed shut. Simultaneously, thick motorized blackout blinds began a slow, synchronized descent along the interior glass walls, sealing the boardroom off completely from the rest of the executive floor. The sudden shift in lighting cast a sharp, intimidating glow across the room, illuminating my face in the pale light of the projection screen. Cameron stopped dead in his tracks. His chest began to heave as the reality of the lockdown set in. He looked at the locked doors, then at the blackout blinds, and finally slowly back to me. "Take a seat, Cameron," I commanded, my voice completely devoid of emotion. He did not argue. His knees gave out and he collapsed heavily into the nearest leather chair, staring at me as if I were a ghost. I turned my attention to the 5 senior board members seated around the table. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, gesturing smoothly toward my brother, "I would like to formally introduce you to Cameron. He is the founder and current CEO of the startup we are evaluating this morning. He also happens to be my older brother. And as you all just heard straight from his own mouth, he is currently committing federal wire fraud by hiding massive corporate debt in offshore holding accounts to deceive his current investors." The board members did not gasp. They did not whisper. They simply jotted down precise notes on their legal pads, their faces entirely impassive. Cameron looked like he was going to vomit. The blood drained so completely from his face that his skin took on a sickly, translucent hue. "Savannah, please," he choked out, raising a trembling hand. "You cannot do this. You do not understand what is happening." "I understand perfectly," I replied, pressing a button on my keyboard, to take control of the massive presentation screen behind me. I minimized his glossy, plagiarized pitch deck and brought up the raw, unfiltered back-end source code of his supposedly revolutionary financial algorithm. The screen filled with thousands of lines of complex color-coded text. "Let us talk about this visionary technology you are trying to sell me for $5 million, I said, leaning forward. "You just stood in my boardroom and claimed you have exclusive rights to a platform that will generate $50 million by next year. So explain line 4200 to me. Explain how the data routing protocol bypasses standard encryption delays without exposing the user's financial routing numbers to third-party scraping." Cameron stared blindly at the massive screen. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, raspy wheeze came out. He looked at the code, as if it were written in an alien language, which to him it absolutely was. "It is a simple question for a tech visionary, Cameron." I prompted, my voice echoing loudly in the sealed room. "Walk my board through the basic architecture of your own software." Well, the routing protocol is highly proprietary," he stammered, pulling at his shirt collar as sweat began to bead on his forehead. "It uses a dynamic interface. My development team handles the micro-level implementation, but the overarching vision is entirely mine." I smiled, a sharp, merciless expression. "You do not even know what programming language you are looking at, do you?" Cameron shrank back into his heavy leather chair, his shoulders hunching defensively. "Savannah, stop it. This is not a game. I am offering you a legitimate business deal." "There is nothing legitimate about you," I stated, dropping the polite corporate facade entirely. "You did not write a single line of this code. You do not even know how to boot up the compiler. You hired a brilliant, hungry young developer named Julian to build this entire infrastructure from scratch. You promised him a 30% equity stake in the company once the software launched. He worked 80-hour weeks for 2 years, sleeping under his desk, building the exact platform you just tried to sell to me." Cameron swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward the locked doors. "That is how the industry works," he muttered defensively. "I took the initial financial risk. I provided the workspace. Julian was just an employee." "He was your lead partner," I corrected sharply. "And 3 days ago, right before the scheduled beta launch, you fired him. You terminated his contract without cause and locked him out of the building. You did it specifically to trigger a predatory clause in his employment contract that voided his unvested equity. You gutted his entire life's work so you could keep 100% of the buyout money for yourself." How do you know that? Cameron demanded, a sudden flash of his old aggressive entitlement flaring up. "That is confidential internal company data. You have been spying on me. I have not been spying on you, Cameron," I replied calmly. "I know all of this because Julian was sitting in the exact chair you are sitting in yesterday morning. I brought him in. I paid him triple the salary you originally promised him to conduct a full independent forensic audit of your software." Cameron's mouth fell open. A look of profound, devastating realization washed over his features. The last remaining pillar of his fragile ego completely collapsed. During that audit, I continued, my voice echoing like a judge, delivering a final sentence. "Julian and I discovered all the hidden debt you just so helpfully confessed to. But more importantly, Julian informed me that he was smart enough to quietly patent the core architecture of this algorithm under his own name 6 months ago, long before you locked him out." I reached into the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick, legally binding document bound in blue, heavy cardstock. I slid it across the long walnut table. It glided perfectly over the polished wood and stopped right at Cameron's fingertips. He stared down at the document as if it were radioactive. "That is a formal cease and desist order," I explained, watching him tremble. "Vanguard Acquisitions is officially rejecting your buyout proposal. You are currently attempting to sell stolen intellectual property to a private equity firm. That is a massive federal crime, Cameron. And considering you just admitted to defrauding your current investors on a recorded line, in front of 5 corporate witnesses, your career in the technology sector is permanently over." Cameron did not touch the document. His chest was heaving uncontrollably now, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. The walls of the soundproof boardroom were closing in on him. The reality of federal prison, of absolute financial ruin, of total public humiliation, was finally crushing the golden boy. He grabbed his chest, hyperventilating, his eyes rolling wildly around the room. No, 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 he panicked, his voice pitching upward into a desperate, pathetic whine. You cannot do this, Savannah. I am your brother. You cannot send me to jail. I just need cash. I just need cash to cover the offshore accounts before the audit. He fell to his knees on the hardwood floor, frantically digging through his pockets. He pulled out his cell phone, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the device twice. He fumbled with the screen, desperately swiping through his contacts until he found the one person who had always bailed him out of every disaster. He hit the speakerphone button and set the phone on the edge of the conference table. The line rang twice. The sound echoed clearly through the dead-silent boardroom. Every member of my executive board watched with quiet clinical fascination. Dad Cameron screamed the second the line connected completely, abandoning any remaining shred of dignity. Dad, you have to help me right now. Savannah set me up. She is the CEO of Vanguard. She owns the company, Dad. She rejected the buyout and she is reporting me to the feds for intellectual property theft and wire fraud. I leaned back in my high-backed leather chair, steepled my fingers, and listened to the sound of my family finally imploding. Dad? Are you listening to me? Cameron begged, tears actively streaming down his face as he yelled into the speakerphone. The investors are going to audit my books next week. I am going to federal prison. You have to wire me money right now. I need a massive cash transfer from your retirement account. You have to send me a portion of your $10 million severance package today so I can pay off the stolen equity and hide the offshore debt. Please, Dad, you have to save me. The heavy mechanical hum of the boardroom's climate control system seemed to amplify the suffocating silence. Cameron remained on his knees, his expensive suit pants gathering dust from the hardwood floor. His phone, resting flat on the polished walnut table, continued its rhythmic electronic ringing. Each digital chime bounced off the frosted glass walls, sounding less like a call for help and more like a countdown to his absolute destruction. My 5 senior board members sat frozen in their high-backed leather chairs. These were some of the most ruthless, brilliant financial minds in Chicago. My chief compliance officer, a former federal prosecutor, adjusted his glasses and stared at the phone. My lead corporate counsel rested her hands on her legal pad, her expression entirely unreadable. They had just watched a man try to sell stolen intellectual property, and now they were waiting to see how much deeper he would dig his own grave. On the 4th ring, the line connected with a sharp click. The sound of ragged, heavy breathing flooded the room. It was immediately clear that Richard was not sitting comfortably in his plush executive office. He sounded frantic, cornered, and entirely unhinged. Cameron, what the hell did you just do? Richard screamed. His voice was raw, stripped of the polished aristocratic charm he had carefully cultivated over his 30-year career. It was the voice of a man watching his life burn to the ground. Dad, please, you have to listen to me. Cameron sobbed, his face hovering just inches from the speakerphone. His voice pitched upward into a desperate, pathetic whine. Vanguard rejected the buyout. Savannah set a trap. She is the CEO. She runs the whole private equity firm. She has the original patent for my software, and she just handed me a cease and desist. Dad, she is going to call the feds. I need $5 million wired to my corporate account right now, or they are going to arrest me for wire fraud. Just send me an advance from your severance package. There was a split second of dead air on the other end of the line. When Richard spoke again, the sheer volume of his rage caused the conference table speakers to distort. Are you completely out of your mind? Richard roared, his voice cracking with hysteria. Are you completely deaf to reality? I cannot wire you $5 million. I cannot wire you $5,000. I do not have a single cent to my name, Cameron. I am completely broke. Cameron stared blindly at the phone, his mouth hanging open. The tears froze on his pale cheeks. What are you talking about? He whimpered, shaking his head in furious denial. You are a senior wealth management partner. You manage billions in client assets. You promised me you would backstop this company. You said you always had a reserve fund for my ventures. Manage them! I stole them, you arrogant fool! Richard shrieked the confession, tearing through the silent boardroom like a physical shockwave. I have been embezzling from my own clients for over a decade. Where do you think the money came from every time one of your pathetic little companies went bankrupt? Where do you think the seed capital came from for your ridiculous lifestyle? Cameron let out a low, strangled gasp. He fell back on his heels, his hands flying to his head as if he could physically protect himself from the words coming out of the speaker. My lead counsel slowly uncapped her pen and began taking precise, meticulous notes on her legal pad. The chief compliance officer leaned forward, his eyes locked onto the cell phone. They were capturing every single word of this unprompted, completely voluntary confession. You burned through $2 million in your 20s pretending to be a tech visionary. Richard continued, his voice dripping with venom and utter despair. You threw away another $1 million on that failed delivery app, and hundreds of thousands more on sports cars, luxury lofts, and underground gambling debts. And your mother, do you think her country club memberships, her daily spa retreats, and her custom jewelry paid for themselves? Do you think my legitimate salary covered her endless spending habits and her trips to Milan? I have been bleeding my clients dry for 10 years just to keep up the illusion that we are untouchable. Richard was hyperventilating now, his breaths coming in short, panicked bursts. I have been forging portfolio statements for elderly clients. I have been siphoning cash from blind escrow accounts. I have been moving dead money around in a massive shell game just to keep this family from drowning. The silence in the Vanguard boardroom was absolute. Cameron was completely paralyzed by shock, unable to reach out and end the call. He was realizing in real time that his entire existence, his ego, his tailored suits, and his unearned confidence were entirely funded by his father's felonies. He was not a golden boy. He was a parasite feeding off the stolen life savings of innocent people. Dad, stop. Cameron choked out, his voice barely a whisper. He finally recognized the catastrophic magnitude of what his father was saying on an unsecured line. Stop talking. I cannot stop! Richard yelled, completely oblivious to his audience. The panic in his voice was escalating into pure, unfiltered terror. I am standing in my office right now running documents through a commercial shredder because the walls are closing in. I kept the plates spinning for 10 years, Cameron. 10 years of risking federal prison every single day just to keep you and your mother happy. And it was all supposed to be fixed tomorrow morning. A harsh, bitter laugh erupted from the speakerphone, sounding more like a sob of pure agony. The Vanguard Acquisitions buyout was my exit strategy. Richard confessed, his words tumbling over each other in a desperate, frantic rush. When they acquired my wealth management firm, my partner agreement guaranteed a $10 million severance package. I did the math perfectly. $10 million was exactly enough to quietly refund the missing client escrow accounts, cover my tracks, and retire clean. That money was my absolute lifeline. We just need my $10 million severance to cover up the missing funds before the new parent company does an audit. Cameron buried his face in his hands, weeping openly and uncontrollably on the floor of the boardroom. His custom-tailored suit was wrinkled, his perfectly styled hair was a mess, and his arrogant illusion of being a self-made tech titan was completely obliterated. He curled into a pathetic ball, his shoulders shaking as his father continued to seal their collective fate. If that money does not hit my account by tomorrow morning, the transition team is going to see the massive holes in the ledger. Richard hyperventilated, his voice echoing off the frosted glass walls. They are going to see that I robbed my clients blind. I am going to lose my license. I am going to lose the house. I am going to die in a federal penitentiary, Cameron. So do not call me crying about your little startup problems. I cannot save you. I cannot even save myself. The line went dead quiet, save for the ragged, heavy breathing of a man standing on the edge of total, inescapable ruin. I sat back in my high-backed leather executive chair, looking down at my older brother. He was curled on my boardroom floor, his hands covering his ears, as if he could somehow block out the devastating truth of his own existence. For his entire life he had looked down on me. He had mocked my education, ridiculed my struggles, and celebrated when our parents threw me out onto the street. He had genuinely believed he was a superior being born to wealth and destined for greatness. Now he knew the truth. His greatness was a toxic lie funded by fraud, theft, and the quiet desperation of a father who was equally corrupt and entirely broken. I looked at my board of directors. The former federal prosecutor gave me a single confirming nod. We had everything we needed to hand Richard directly to the authorities. The destruction of the Golden Boy and his enabler was complete. I slowly reached out across the polished walnut table. I pressed the silver intercom button connected directly to the speakerphone module. A small red light flared to life, indicating the microphone was active and broadcasting my voice with crystal clear precision. The new parent company already did the audit, Dad. The dial tone pierced the heavy silence of the boardroom like a flat line on a heart monitor. I did not say another word. I simply reached across the polished walnut table and pressed the silver button on my console, disconnecting the call. The dial tone vanished, leaving only the pathetic sound of Cameron weeping openly into the expensive carpet. His entire fabricated life had just been vaporized in a single phone call. I signaled Marcus and the rest of my security team with a brief nod. They hauled my sobbing brother off the floor to escort him out of the building and hand his recorded confession over to our legal department. The Golden Boy was finished, and the trap for my father was perfectly set. 8 hours later, the sterile corporate environment of Vanguard Acquisitions was replaced by the breathtaking opulence of the Grand Solstice Ballroom. The venue was dripping in crystal chandeliers and gold accents. I was hosting a highly exclusive private charity gala designed specifically to launch a massive new initiative for local foster children. The massive room was filled with Chicago's most elite politicians, venture capitalists, and philanthropists. I wore a floor-length emerald silk gown holding a crystal glass of sparkling water as I navigated the sea of powerful people. It was a flawless evening until the poison from my past inevitably tracked me down. I had briefly stepped into the semi-private VIP lounge overlooking the main dance floor, seeking a moment of quiet before the main speeches began. The heavy velvet curtains at the entrance of the enclave were suddenly and violently shoved aside. Richard and Patricia marched into the exclusive space, completely bypassing the security detail at the door. They looked absolutely frantic. My father was sweating profusely, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned and his bow tie hanging loose around his neck. His face was flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. Patricia looked equally unhinged, her eyes darting wildly around the room as she gripped a heavily beaded designer clutch like a weapon. They had obviously tracked my movements through a desperate series of aggressive phone calls to my old temp agency associates. Patricia immediately clocked the presence of 3 prominent bank executives and a state senator standing just a few feet away from us in the lounge. She inhaled sharply, her eyes flashing with a desperate opportunistic light. She launched right into the performance of a lifetime. "Oh, my poor sweet Savannah!" She cried out, her voice intentionally, carrying perfectly over the ambient jazz music floating up from the ballroom. She rushed forward, throwing her hands up to her face in an exaggerated display of maternal agony. "Everyone, please excuse my daughter. She is profoundly unwell. She is experiencing a severe mental breakdown and requires immediate psychiatric intervention." She turned to the wealthy guests nearby, forcing a dramatic, tearful sob. "She is completely delusional. She is trying to ruin her own family financially because she refuses to take her medication. Please, you have to understand that she does not know what she is doing. She is a deeply disturbed young woman destroying her own father out of pure spite." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I remained completely stoic, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water. I watched my mother weaponize social shame, assuming the threat of public embarrassment would force me into panicked compliance. She thought the presence of high society would make me shrink away, just as it always had when I was a teenager. Richard stepped forward, pushing his way past his wailing wife. He did not yell. He used his signature corporate intimidation tactic, lowering his voice to a lethal, venomous register meant only for my ears. "You are going to fix that audit." "Savannah," he ordered, his chest heaving with desperate, ragged breaths. "You are going to pick up your phone and authorize the release of my $10 million severance funds right now, or I will destroy your entire company by sunrise. I have the private cell phone numbers of every major financial journalist at the Wall Street Journal. I will tell them the absolute truth. I will tell them that Vanguard Acquisitions is run by a vindictive, uneducated college dropout. I will expose this entire hostile takeover as a petty, spiteful vendetta against your own family." He leaned in closer, his face contorted into a mask of pure terror, masked as rage. "When the market opens on Monday morning, I will tank your stock. Your board of directors will oust you immediately once they realize you are using billions of dollars in corporate funds to settle childhood grudges. Give me my money." I looked at his sweating, desperate face, feeling absolutely nothing but cold indifference. "You are going to call the press and tell them I am mentally unstable?" I asked, my voice perfectly level, cutting through the quiet jazz music. "That is the exact same strategy you used 13 years ago, Dad." Richard blinked momentarily, thrown off balance by my complete lack of fear. "When you let Mom throw me out onto the street with $200, you panicked because you thought I would report you for draining my college fund." I continued, my words striking like precise surgical incisions. "So you called every single one of our relatives. You called Aunt Martha and Uncle Greg and told them I had suffered a psychotic break. You told them I was violently unstable and stealing from you to buy drugs so that absolutely no one in our extended family would offer me a place to sleep. You weaponized my reputation and destroyed my name to cover up the fact that you stole my education to pay off Cameron's gambling debts. And now you think that same tired, pathetic tactic is going to work on Wall Street." Patricia gasped, clutching her pearl necklace. "That is a lie. You were out of control. We did what we had to do to protect the family." "You did what you had to do to protect your country club memberships," I corrected, turning my dead gaze to my mother. "You protected a son who was bleeding your finances dry while you stood by and watched your husband embezzle client funds to pay for your trips to Milan. Do not stand in my venue and pretend you are a victim, Patricia." Richard grabbed my wrist, his grip painfully tight as his facade completely shattered. "You listen to me, you arrogant little girl," he hissed, his eyes wide and unblinking. "I do not care about the past. I care about right now. I am not going to federal prison because you want to play CEO. You are nothing but a dropout playing dress-up. You are going to transfer my $10 million to my offshore account immediately, or I swear to God I will end you." Before I could even formulate a reply, a sudden sharp feedback whine echoed through the ballroom's massive sound system. The smooth, authoritative voice of the evening's master of ceremonies boomed through the overhead speakers, silencing the ambient chatter and completely drowning out Patricia's fake sobbing. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies announced, his voice ringing with profound respect, "if I could please direct your attention to the main stage. Tonight we are here to celebrate a monumental achievement for the vulnerable youth of our city. But this entire evening, this breathtaking event, and the $20 million initiative that will completely revolutionize our foster care system would not exist without the unparalleled generosity of one incredibly private individual." Patricia sniffled, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue, assuming the speech had absolutely nothing to do with us. She kept her victimized expression plastered on her face, hoping the nearby bank executives were still watching her with sympathy. Richard glared at me, his chest rising and falling rapidly, waiting for my compliance. "We are deeply honored to finally recognize the sole benefactor who entirely funded the Hope Horizon Foundation." The master of ceremonies continued, his voice swelling with genuine admiration. "Please direct your applause to the upper lounge and join me in thanking the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Acquisitions, Miss Savannah." The heavy velvet curtains concealing our enclave were pulled completely back by the event staff in one swift, synchronized motion. A brilliant white spotlight hit me perfectly, illuminating the emerald silk of my gown against the dark backdrop of the lounge. The entire ballroom filled with the most powerful billionaires, politicians, and socialites Richard had spent his entire pathetic career desperately trying to impress, turned toward our balcony. They erupted into deafening, wild applause. The bank CEOs and the state senator, who had been standing mere feet away from Patricia's manic performance, raised their glasses in my direction, clapping enthusiastically. Richard and Patricia froze, entirely paralyzed in the blinding spotlight. Their mouths hung open as the applause washed over them. They stood completely exposed in their rumpled clothes, looking like absolute fools in front of the exact high society elite they had worshipped their entire lives. The deafening applause of Chicago's elite crashed over Richard and Patricia like a physical wave. The glittering chandeliers above us cast a golden light over the VIP lounge, creating a stark contrast to the dark, suffocating fear radiating from my parents. The state senator raised his glass higher, oblivious to the absolute terror paralyzing my mother and father. Patricia's eyes darted wildly around the room. She realized in a fraction of a second that her carefully crafted victim narrative had completely disintegrated. The wealthy benefactors she had just tried to manipulate were currently giving me a standing ovation. There was no sympathy left for her here, only the cold, harsh glare of a spotlight that illuminated her irrelevance. Richard remained frozen, his jaw working soundlessly as he stared at me. He was completely out of his depth, a man watching his empire evaporate into the very air he was breathing. But my mother was a different breed of predator. When the social pressure failed, she pivoted immediately to her secondary survival instinct. Her hand lashed out, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into the emerald silk of my gown and wrapping around my wrist with bruising force. She leaned in close, her designer perfume masking the sour scent of her desperation. She jerked her head toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the lounge, indicating the private executive cloakroom. I allowed her to pull me away from the balcony edge. I wanted to see exactly what her contingency plan looked like. The moment the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind us, the ambient jazz music and the roar of the crowd vanished, replaced by the dead, suffocating silence of a heavily soundproofed room. The air inside felt distinctly chilled, smelling faintly of cedar and expensive leather. Patricia let go of my wrist and spun around. The weeping, hysterical mother who had been sobbing into a tissue mere seconds ago disappeared entirely. Her posture straightened, her tears vanished, as if turned off by a switch, and her expression hardened into a mask of cold, calculating malice. She smoothed the front of her expensive evening gown and glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You really think you have won, Savannah?" She spat, her voice dropping the dramatic tremor and taking on a sharp metallic edge. "You think because you bought yourself a fancy title and threw some money at a bunch of orphans that you can dictate terms to us. You are still the same pathetic, ungrateful child who tried to destroy this family." I stood perfectly still, smoothing the silk of my dress, where her claws had wrinkled the fabric. I did not say a word. I simply watched her, studying the frantic pulse jumping at the base of her throat. My silence only infuriated her further. She reached into her heavily beaded clutch and pulled out her smartphone, her fingers tapping furiously against the illuminated glass screen. "Your father might be panicking, but I do not panic," Patricia stated, holding the phone up between us. "You see, when Cameron called us crying from your boardroom, I knew exactly what you were trying to do. You want to play corporate warfare. Fine. We will play." She pressed a button on the screen and thrust the device toward my face. A choppy, slightly distorted audio recording began to play. It was my voice, or rather a highly sophisticated manipulation of my voice. The cadence was right, the pitch was identical, but the words were spliced together with an unnatural, breathless urgency, capturing the exact tone I used during board meetings and weaponizing my own authority against me. "I need the proprietary data from Richard's internal servers," the digital voice said, echoing clearly in the small room. "Access the client escrow files and reroute the transaction histories. I do not care what laws we break. I want his firm gutted from the inside out before Vanguard announces the acquisition. I want him ruined." The recording stopped with a harsh digital click. Patricia smiled, a cruel, triumphant expression that twisted her features into something grotesque. She slipped the phone back into her clutch and crossed her arms over her chest. "I have 3 copies of that file safely secured," she said, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "A brilliant little audio engineer friend of Cameron's put it together for me this afternoon. It cost a small fortune, but it is flawless. It will pass any preliminary forensic sweep." If you do not sign a legally binding document releasing your father's $10 million severance package by midnight tonight, I will send this recording directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FBI, and the Board of Directors at Vanguard Acquisitions. They will launch an immediate federal investigation into your business practices. Your stock will absolutely plummet, your investors will flee, and you will spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary for corporate espionage and market manipulation. I tilted my head, studying her face. She was practically vibrating with adrenaline, utterly convinced she had backed me into an inescapable corner. You want me to sign a document authorizing the release of stolen client funds to cover up my father's felonies? I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion. And you are using a forged, deeply manipulated audio file to extort my compliance. That is exactly what I am doing, Patricia confirmed, her chin raising defiantly. And do not think for 1 second that I will hesitate to ruin your life to save my own. I smiled then. It was not a happy smile. It was a cold, razor-sharp expression that finally matched the temperature in the room. I know you will not hesitate, Mom, I replied, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. Because this is the exact same strategy you used when I was 20 years old. You are nothing if not entirely predictable. Patricia's confident smirk faltered slightly, her eyes narrowing as I closed the distance between us. You think I forgot how you operate? I continued, my words striking like physical blows. You think I forgot the night you summoned the entire extended family to the house for an emergency intervention? I had just found out that Dad completely drained my college trust fund, every single penny my grandfather had left me to pay off Cameron's staggering underground sports betting debts before the bookies broke his legs. I was going to expose the theft. I was going to tell everyone exactly where the money went. But you beat me to it. I watched the memory flash across her eyes, the sudden uncomfortable recognition of her own monstrous behavior. You pulled me into the study before the guests arrived, I said, my voice echoing off the oak-paneled walls of the cloakroom. You showed me a forged bank statement and a completely fabricated email chain. You had paid someone to make it look like I had stolen $50,000 from Dad's corporate account to buy narcotics. You told me that if I said one single word about Cameron's gambling, you would hand that forged evidence directly to the police. You told me you would have me arrested, imprisoned, and completely erased from the family. Patricia swallowed hard, taking a slight step backward as I continued to advance. And then you walked out into the living room. I pressed on, refusing to let her look away. You turned on the tears just like you did 10 minutes ago on the balcony. You cried to Aunt Martha and Uncle Greg. You told them I was a violent, unstable addict. You used that forged evidence to convince everyone I loved that I was a criminal. You watched me get exiled from my own family, thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing but a duffel bag and a bus pass, all to protect your precious golden boy and your pristine country club reputation. You destroyed my life with a lie because it was convenient for you. That was different, Patricia stammered, her voice suddenly losing its sharp edge. You were out of control. You were threatening to tear the family apart over money. We had to protect Cameron. He was fragile. He needed our support. He was a parasite, I corrected sharply, my voice cracking like a whip through the chilled air of the cloakroom. And you are a coward who uses psychological warfare because you fundamentally lack the intelligence to fight fair in a real boardroom. You successfully terrified a 20-year-old girl who had no resources, no money, and no allies. But I am not 20 years old anymore, Patricia. I am not terrified, and I am certainly not powerless. Patricia rallied, pulling her shoulders back and lifting her chin in a desperate attempt to reclaim her authority. It does not matter what happened in the past. She snapped her hand, drifting back toward her clutch and the phone hidden inside. The facts right now are very simple. I have the recording. I have the leverage. You are going to authorize the transfer, or I am going to destroy Vanguard Acquisitions by morning. You have no way out of this, Savannah. Sign the authorization or go to prison. I let her finish. I let her stand there, practically vibrating with triumphant malice, absolutely certain that she had secured her victory. I waited until the silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the weight of her desperate extortion. Then I smiled. It was a broad, genuine, and utterly merciless smile. I slowly raised my right hand, extending my index finger toward the ceiling. I pointed directly at a small, sleek, discreet black dome mounted perfectly in the corner of the room right above where Patricia was standing. Patricia followed my gesture, her eyes locking onto the dark, glossy surface of the dome. She frowned clearly, not comprehending what she was looking at. "This is my hotel, Mom," I stated, my voice echoing with terrifying absolute authority. "I bought this entire property 6 months ago through a Vanguard holding company. And this specific cloakroom was not designed for coats. It was specifically retrofitted and designed for high-level, highly sensitive corporate negotiations." The color drained from Patricia's face with alarming speed. She looked from the black dome back to me, her breath catching in her throat as the horrifying reality of her situation began to dawn on her. "There are microphones embedded in the oak paneling," I explained, dropping my hand and clasping my fingers together in front of me. "The acoustic engineering is flawless. You just confessed to fabricating false evidence. You just admitted to previously framing me for a crime I did not commit. And you just explicitly threatened to release forged, manipulated audio to federal authorities unless I transferred $10 million to cover up my father's embezzlement." Patricia's knees actually buckled. She staggered backward, hitting the solid oak door behind her with a dull thud. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated terror as she stared at the black dome on the ceiling. "You just committed felony extortion on a closed-circuit high-definition security feed." I smiled, watching her world completely collapse. Patricia slid down the heavy oak paneling of the cloakroom door, her legs completely giving out beneath her as the blood drained from her face. The forged audio file on her phone was no longer a weapon to be wielded against me. It was a digital confession, a loaded gun she had just unwittingly pointed directly at her own head. I did not offer her a hand. I did not offer a single word of comfort or pity. I simply turned on my heel, the emerald silk of my gown sweeping quietly across the polished floor, and walked back out into the glittering ballroom. The night was a massive, unprecedented success, raising millions for vulnerable children, while my mother remained trapped in a soundproof tomb of her own making, completely paralyzed by the realization that her era of manipulation was permanently over. The morning sun cut sharply through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office at Vanguard Acquisitions. The city of Chicago stretched out beneath me, a sprawling grid of glass and steel that I had conquered through relentless, exhausting work. I sat behind my massive obsidian desk, sipping black coffee, meticulously reviewing the final transition documents for the hostile takeover of my father's wealth management firm. The absolute insulated silence of the executive floor was a sanctuary. But that sanctuary was violently shattered just before 9 o'clock. The heavy frosted glass doors of my suite were shoved open so forcefully they banged against the rubber doorstops. Richard marched in his face, a mask of desperate, aggressive arrogance. He was not alone. Trailing closely behind him, looking remarkably like a rat caught in a trap, was Arthur Sterling. Arthur was a sleazy bottom-tier probate attorney my parents had used for decades to bully local contractors, dispute minor traffic violations, and intimidate former business partners who lacked the capital to defend themselves. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit and sweated profusely, clutching a battered leather briefcase against his chest, like a physical shield against the intimidating modern architecture of my firm. Richard slapped his palms flat on my desk, leaning over my workspace with the same physical intimidation tactics he had tried to use to control my mother and me for 30 years. He looked absolutely exhausted. The bags under his eyes were practically bruised. His tie was slightly crooked, and a faint tremor shook his hands. But his overwhelming greed and his pathological need to dominate had clearly overridden whatever basic survival instinct he had left. Without a word of greeting, Richard snatched a thick, legal-sized envelope from Arthur's trembling fingers and slammed it down onto my keyboard. The heavy thud echoed sharply in the quiet office. Arthur shifted uncomfortably pointedly, avoiding my gaze, staring instead at the abstract painting on the far wall, as if wishing he could meld into the canvas and disappear entirely. "Read it and weep, Savannah," Richard snarled a triumphant, ugly sneer, twisting his features into something grotesque. You thought you could trap me. You thought you could just waltz in and lock me out of my own $10 million severance package. But you forgot exactly who you are dealing with. I spent the entire night tearing apart your grandfather's estate files, going through every single box in the family archive down in the basement. I looked down at the thick manila envelope, but I did not make a single move to open it. I kept my hands steepled under my chin, leaning back in my high-backed leather chair, and watching his frantic, manic performance with clinical detachment. That is a newly discovered, fully notarized addendum to your grandfather's last will and testament. Richard announced, his voice vibrating with malicious, unearned glee. Arthur here just miraculously uncovered it in a misfiled estate ledger this morning. It explicitly outlines that the seed money your grandfather left you, the exact same money you used to buy your first commercial property and start this ridiculous little empire of yours, was originally and legally designated for Cameron. It stipulates that in the event of Cameron's financial hardship, all assets derived from that initial seed capital must be returned to the primary family estate. I stared at my father, genuinely astounded by the sheer, staggering depth of his delusion. They had lost the software patent. They had been caught committing felony extortion on a closed-circuit security camera. And now, cornered like rabid animals, they were resorting to the blatant amateur forgery of a dead man's final wishes. My grandfather had explicitly bypassed Richard and Cameron because he knew exactly what kind of financial predators they were. He had placed that money in an ironclad trust specifically for me to ensure they could never touch it, knowing they would eventually try to steal it. Arthur cleared his throat, adjusting his cheap tie with a sweaty hand. According to the document, Miss Savannah, you are currently in possession of stolen familial assets. The lawyer stammered, his voice lacking any real conviction, as he glanced nervously at the sleek security cameras mounted in my office corners. The family estate is demanding the immediate surrender of all your holdings, including your controlling stake in Vanguard Acquisitions, to right this historical financial wrong. We are prepared to file an injunction to freeze your corporate accounts by noon today if you do not comply with these terms. Richard took my silence for terror. He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a condescending, venomous whisper, relishing what he believed was his ultimate victory over the daughter he despised. You are going to sign over your assets to Cameron right now, he demanded, slamming his fist onto my desk for emphasis. If you refuse, Arthur is going to tie you up in probate court for the next 10 years. I know exactly how private equity works, Savannah. I know exactly how much cash you have tied up in illiquid commercial real estate and long-term corporate bonds. You are an uneducated college dropout playing a high-stakes game you fundamentally do not understand. You do not have the liquid cash reserves to fight a protracted, scorched earth legal battle against your own family. He paced back and forth in front of my desk, his adrenaline fueling his manic rant. I will freeze every single one of your operating accounts with a court order. I will drown your legal team in endless discovery requests. I will drag your investors into depositions and destroy your market credibility. I will bleed you dry with attorney fees and court costs until you are begging to give me this company just to pay your grocery bill. You thought you were so smart because you manipulated some code and bought a fancy hotel. But this is the real world. The legal system belongs to people like me. People who know how to twist the rules until they break and crush anyone who stands in their way. He stopped pacing and pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. You are going to sign the surrender documents, authorize the release of my $10 million severance funds to cover my audit, and walk away with absolutely nothing. Or I will bury you so deep in litigation you will never see daylight again. I let him finish. I let him stand there, his chest heaving, practically vibrating with triumphant malice, absolutely certain that he had secured his victory through brute force and intimidation. I waited until the silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the weight of his desperate extortion attempt. I looked at the forged document resting on my keyboard, then up at Arthur, who was now sweating so profusely a drop rolled down the side of his cheek. Finally, I locked eyes with my father. He was so utterly convinced of his own superiority that he had walked straight into a trap carrying a fake legal document that would guarantee his imprisonment alongside his wife. I did not even bother reading the fake document. I pressed a button on my intercom. The door opened, and a team of the most ruthless elite corporate litigators in the country stepped into the room. 4 individuals stepped through the frosted glass doors of my executive suite. They moved with the synchronized predatory precision of apex hunters closing in on a severely wounded animal. At their center was Evelyn Sterling, my lead corporate counsel, a woman whose mere presence in a courtroom usually prompted opposing attorneys to seek an immediate, unconditional settlement. She wore a tailored charcoal suit and carried a sleek titanium briefcase that looked more like a weapon than a filing system. Beside her were 3 of the most feared, relentless probate and fraud litigators in Chicago. They did not look at Richard. Their eyes locked immediately and exclusively onto Arthur. Arthur visibly shrank. The cheap, shiny fabric of his gray suit seemed to swallow his narrow frame whole as he clutched his battered leather briefcase to his chest. He took a stumbling step backward until his shoulder blades hit the glass wall of the office. He knew exactly who these people were. Any lawyer operating within a 500-mile radius of the financial district knew Evelyn. She was an absolute executioner in a courtroom famous for dissecting fraudulent claims and destroying the careers of anyone stupid enough to present them. Richard, entirely blinded by his own frantic desperation and towering ego, completely missed the catastrophic shift in the room's dynamic. He puffed out his chest and pointed a trembling finger at Evelyn, attempting to maintain his crumbling authority. "You can bring in all the overpriced suits you want," Richard barked, though his voice lacked its previous booming resonance. "The law is the law. That addendum is legally binding, and it completely strips Savannah of her authority over this firm. You have no legal standing to deny the estate." Evelyn did not acknowledge his outburst. She did not even look at him. She walked smoothly up to my obsidian desk, reached out with a manicured hand, and picked up the thick manila envelope Richard had thrown onto my keyboard. She slid the document out, her sharp eyes scanning the single page for a total of perhaps 10 seconds. The silence in the office was so absolute, so heavy with impending violence that the crisp rustle of the heavy cardstock sounded like a gunshot. Evelyn let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a terrifying, hollow sound. She dropped the paper back onto my desk as if it were highly contaminated evidence. "Arthur," Evelyn said, her voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "Did you actually draft this pathetic excuse for a legal document? Or did Richard simply hand it to you in the parking lot and demand you play delivery boy?" Arthur opened his mouth, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit, but only a dry, raspy wheeze emerged from his throat. "Because if you drafted this," Evelyn continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the terrified probate attorney, "I will have you disbarred before you reach the lobby elevator. Let us look at the blatant, laughable amateurism on display here. First, the notary stamp at the bottom of the page belongs to Cook County, but it uses a digital registry format that was not implemented until 3 years after the date of the deceased's passing. Second, the legal statutes cited in paragraph 4 regarding custodial asset reversion were formally repealed and rewritten by the state legislature a full 18 months after this document was supposedly notarized." Richard swallowed hard. He looked from Evelyn to Arthur, waiting for his longtime lawyer to fight back, to pull some legal loophole out of the air and save the situation. "Arthur, tell her she is wrong," Richard commanded, his voice pitching up in genuine panic. "Tell her the document is ironclad. We verified the signatures." Arthur did not defend the document. He did not defend Richard. He practically threw his battered leather briefcase onto the nearest leather chair and began frantically snapping the brass clasps shut. "I advised you against this," Arthur stammered, his face pale and dripping with cold sweat as he backed away from the desk. "I told you I was just a consultant for the estate. I told you I would not put my signature on anything unverified. I am not going down for this, Richard. I am not losing my license and going to federal prison for your psychotic family vendetta." Without waiting for a response, Arthur grabbed his briefcase and bolted. He shoved past the 2 associate litigators blocking the doorway and practically sprinted down the executive hallway toward the elevators. The heavy frosted glass doors swung shut behind him, sealing Richard inside the room with his absolute worst nightmares. Richard stood entirely alone. The arrogant bravado melted off his frame, leaving a hollow, exhausted old man who had finally run out of options, victims, and lies. He looked at the forged document sitting on my desk, then up at me. His chest heaving, he tried to salvage whatever microscopic shred of control he thought he still possessed. "It does not matter," Richard rasped, gripping the back of a guest chair to steady his trembling legs. "The spirit of the document is true. That money was family money. It was meant to be shared. You stole it to build this company, Savannah. You hoarded it while your own brother was drowning. You owe this family." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool obsidian surface of my desk. "I did not hoard anything." I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion, echoing sharply against the glass walls. "And I certainly did not steal the seed capital. But we both know exactly who did." I nodded to Evelyn. She stepped forward, opening her sleek titanium briefcase with a sharp click. She pulled out a heavy leather-bound folio and dropped it onto the center of my desk. It landed with a dense, authoritative thud that made Richard flinch. It was not a single sheet of paper. It was a massive, meticulously documented financial ledger bound by thick brass rings. "Let us talk about what really happened to my initial inheritance," I said, watching Richard's eyes lock onto the leather folio. "Let us talk about what happened 13 years ago when I was exactly 20 years old. You told the entire extended family that I blew my college fund. You told them I was a delinquent who drained my own custodial accounts on partying and bad investments. You used that lie to turn everyone against me so they would not look too closely at the bank statements." Richard opened his mouth to argue, to deny the past just as he always did, but no sound came out. He stared at the leather folio as if it were a bomb about to detonate. "Grandpa knew exactly what kind of financial predator you were, Dad." I explained, my words striking him with lethal, calculated precision. "He knew that if he left me money, you would find a way to bleed it dry to fund Cameron's spectacular, unending failures. So before he died, he secretly handed me the master keys to a secondary hidden blind trust. A trust specifically designed to monitor and record every single transaction involving the primary custodial accounts you had access to." I opened the leather folio and flipped to a page marked with a bright red tab. I spun the massive binder around so it faced Richard directly. "These are the true, unfiltered bank records from 13 years ago," I stated, watching the blood drain completely from his face. "They show the exact IP addresses, the exact routing numbers, and the exact forged signature you used to illegally access my primary custodial account. You committed grand larceny against your own daughter, Richard. You stole over $300,000 of my money and funneled it directly into a shell company to pay off Cameron's underground sports betting debts before the bookies broke his legs." Richard collapsed into the leather guest chair. His legs simply gave out. He stared at the highlighted bank routing numbers on the page, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The realization that I had held this evidence for over a decade, that I had known the absolute truth while he paraded around calling me a failure, was completely destroying his mind. "You smugly claimed I was an uneducated dropout who could not afford to fight you." I continued, my voice merciless and steady. "You thought you could bleed me dry legally because I had no resources. But you failed to realize that I used the money from the hidden blind trust to build Vanguard Acquisitions. I spent the last 10 years building a massive corporate empire for one single specific purpose. I built this private equity firm to buy your wealth management company, trigger an independent audit of your client ledgers, and watch you drown in your own corruption." Richard put his head in his hands, weeping openly. The abusive patriarch who had ruled our family through fear, financial manipulation, and endless gaslighting was entirely gone. He was nothing but a broken criminal facing the end of his life. "Savannah, please," he sobbed, his voice muffled by his trembling hands, sounding pathetic and small. "I am your father. You cannot do this. If you turn those records over, the feds will put me away for the rest of my life. I will lose everything. Just let me have the severance. Let me pay back the clients I embezzled from. Let me fix the accounts, please. We are family." I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I looked at Evelyn. She stepped forward, retrieving a thick, professionally bound blue folder from her titanium briefcase. She did not hand it to him gently. She dropped it directly onto his lap. Evelyn stared down at him, her expression carved from absolute ice. "This isn't a negotiation, Richard. You've just been served with a civil lawsuit for 15 years of compounded fraud, theft, and embezzlement." The heavy blue folder sat on Richard's lap like an anchor pulling him straight down to the bottom of the ocean. He did not move to open it. He simply stared at the embossed gold lettering of Evelyn's law firm on the cover, his breath hitching in a high, unnatural wheeze. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch of the family dynasty was entirely gone. In his place sat a terrified, hyperventilating old man whose entire fabricated reality had just been atomized. His hands shook violently, tapping against the leather armrests of the chair as he looked around my office, desperately searching for an exit that did not exist. Just as the suffocating silence threatened to crush him completely, the frosted glass doors to my executive suite flew open once again. Patricia stumbled into the room, pushing past my stunned administrative assistant. My mother looked completely unhinged. Her designer trench coat was misbuttoned, her perfectly styled hair was disheveled from the harsh Chicago wind, and the frantic, panicked energy radiating from her was palpable. She had obviously spent the entire night dealing with the humiliating aftermath of her extortion attempt at the charity gala, likely waiting in the lobby for Richard to secure the forged will, only to panic when Arthur sprinted out of the building, looking like a ghost. Patricia froze the moment she processed the scene. She saw Evelyn and my team of corporate litigators standing like sentinels around my obsidian desk. She saw the massive leather ledger of bank records open in front of me. And then she saw her husband collapsed in the guest chair, weeping silently into his trembling hands, with a federal lawsuit resting on his lap. Richard. Patricia gasped, rushing to his side and gripping his shoulder. "What is happening?" "What did she do?" Richard could not even speak. He just shook his head, burying his face deeper into his palms. Evelyn took a deliberate step back, folding her arms across her charcoal suit, allowing me to take absolute control of the room. I remained perfectly stoic, leaning back in my leather chair and watching my parents realize that they were completely trapped. "There is nowhere left to run, Mom," I stated, my voice cutting through the quiet office with absolute terrifying calm. "The forged will you two tried to use this morning is dead. The stolen trust fund money from 13 years ago is fully documented. The fraud is exposed. It is over." Patricia looked from me to the blue folder on Richard's lap. The color completely drained from her face. She realized instantly that brute force and intimidation had failed. The legal threats had failed. The forged documents had failed. So like the seasoned predator she was, she immediately pivoted to her absolute final weapon: emotional manipulation. The sharp, venomous mother from the cloakroom vanished. Her posture softened, her shoulders slumped, and her eyes filled with wide, shimmering, manufactured tears. She let go of Richard's shoulder and took a slow, hesitant step toward my desk, holding her hands out in a gesture of maternal pleading. "Savannah, please." Patricia whispered, her voice cracking with the perfect pitch of a devastated, loving mother. "You have to stop this. Look at your father. Look at what this is doing to him. He is an old man. He has a bad heart. If you push this lawsuit, if you expose this to the authorities, the stress will literally kill him. Is that what you want? Do you want to be responsible for destroying your own father?" I did not flinch. I kept my expression carved from stone. "You are not going to put his crimes on my conscience, Patricia," I replied smoothly. "He destroyed himself the moment he decided to steal my inheritance to fund Cameron's gambling addiction. But he did it for the family." Patricia cried out, stepping closer, her tears finally spilling over her cheeks. "We were drowning, Savannah. The market had turned, the business was struggling, and Cameron was in so much trouble. We were just trying to keep everyone afloat. We were trying to protect our name, our legacy. We are your family. We are your blood. You cannot just erase us over money." She reached out, resting her manicured fingers on the edge of my obsidian desk, leaning in with a look of desperate, absolute pleading. "Think about when you were little," she continued, her voice dropping to a soft, nostalgic whisper. designed to break my heart. Think about the summers we spent at the lake house. Think about your father teaching you how to ride your bike in the driveway, holding onto the seat so you would not fall. We loved you, Savannah. We still love you. We made terrible, desperate mistakes because we were terrified of losing everything. But we can fix this. If you just drop these lawsuits, if you just let us walk away and retire quietly, we can heal. We can finally be the real family you always wanted us to be. We can spend holidays together. We can be a part of your life again. Please, sweetie, please do not do this to your own flesh and blood. Richard lifted his head from his hands, his eyes bloodshot and pleading. He latched onto Patricia's manipulation like a drowning man grabbing a life preserver. She is right, Savannah. Richard choked out, his voice thick with tears. I am so sorry. I was blind, I was stupid, and I was cruel to you. I let my ego and my fear control me. But I am begging you on my knees to show us mercy. Do not send me to prison. Do not take our home. You are so successful now. You have everything you could ever want. You do not need to destroy us to prove your point. Let us be a family again. I promise I will make it up to you. I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you. I sat in the absolute silence of my office, listening to the echoes of their desperate weeping pleas. I looked at the two people who had brought me into this world, the two people who were supposed to protect me, nurture me, and guide me. They were offering me the one thing I had craved for my entire childhood, their love, their approval, and their inclusion. 10 years ago, that offer would have broken me. 10 years ago, I would have dropped the lawsuits, signed over the money, and thanked them for finally loving me. But I was not that broken little girl anymore. I leaned forward, clasping my hands together on the desk. You want to talk about family? I said, my voice completely devoid of the sympathy they were desperately trying to extract. You want to weaponize childhood memories of bike rides and lake houses to excuse the fact that you threw me away. Patricia flinched, recognizing the absolute coldness in my tone. Savannah, please, I am telling you the truth, we love you. Family does not let their child starve. Patricia, I interrupted, my voice rising just enough to command absolute silence in the room. Family does not illegally drain a 20-year-old girl's custodial accounts, forge her signature, and then frame her for narcotics theft to cover up their own grand larceny. Family does not throw their daughter out onto the freezing streets of Chicago with $200 in her pocket and a fabricated criminal reputation that ensured no relative would ever give her a place to sleep. Richard squeezed his eyes shut, fresh tears leaking down his cheeks as I laid out the exact brutal reality of their actions. Do you have any idea what it was like? I asked, my words sharp and precise. Do you know what it feels like to sleep in a bus terminal because your own mother convinced your aunt that you were a violent addict? Do you know what it feels like to work 3 minimum wage jobs, scrubbing floors in commercial office buildings at 3 in the morning just to afford ramen noodles in a shared studio apartment with no heating? I sacrificed my education. I sacrificed my youth. I sacrificed my health to survive the absolute destruction you inflicted upon me, simply because I threatened to expose your golden boy. I stood up slowly, towering over my desk, radiating the absolute authority of a woman who had walked through hell and emerged completely fireproof. You do not get to invoke the word family to save yourselves from federal prison, I stated, staring directly into Patricia's terrified eyes. You do not love me. You love my money, and you are terrified of my power. You are offering me a fake, hollow relationship because you are cornered. Your weaponized guilt has absolutely zero power over me. I do not want holidays with you. I do not want your fake apologies. And I certainly do not want to be part of your family. Patricia let out a shattered, breathless sob, covering her mouth with her hand as she stumbled backward. The realization that she could not manipulate me, that her tears and her maternal pleading had completely failed, finally broke her. She looked at Richard, utterly defeated. They had played every single card in their deck. They had tried intimidation, legal threats, forgery, and emotional extortion, and they had lost on every single front. Richard stared at the floor, his shoulders heaving. Fine, he whispered, his voice completely dead. You win, Savannah. You win. We will surrender the firm. We will give you the remaining assets. Just leave Cameron out of this. He does not know about the forged will. He does not know about the trust fund theft from 13 years ago. I did it all myself to protect him. Just let your brother walk away clean, and I will plead guilty to whatever your lawyers want. Even now, facing total annihilation, his primary instinct was to protect his precious parasitic son. He was willing to go to federal prison, willing to lose everything as long as Cameron remained untouched. I looked at Evelyn. She did not smile, but a glint of absolute predatory satisfaction flashed in her eyes. I slowly reached into the top drawer of my obsidian desk. I pulled out a single crisp manila folder. It was surprisingly thin, containing only a few pages of heavy watermarked legal paper. I placed it on the desk and rested my hand flat against the cover. You are willing to fall on your sword to protect Cameron, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal register. You are willing to take the full blame for the embezzlement, the fraud, and the forged documents, just to make sure your golden boy does not spend a single day behind bars. That is a very touching display of fatherly devotion, Richard. It truly is. Richard looked up, confusion mixing with the absolute terror in his eyes. But you see, I continued tapping my manicured fingernail against the folder. The problem with raising a spoiled, entitled parasite who has never faced a single consequence in his entire life is that he possesses absolutely zero loyalty when the pressure gets applied. When Cameron called you crying from my boardroom yesterday, he was not just upset that his career was over. He was terrified because my security team was holding him for corporate espionage. Patricia gasped, her hands dropping from her mouth. What did you do to him? I did exactly what I promised, I replied smoothly. I gave him a choice. I told him he could either take the fall for the massive coordinated fraud happening inside your wealth management firm, or he could save himself. I picked up the manila folder and slid it across the smooth black surface of my desk. It stopped perfectly at the edge, right in front of Richard's trembling hands. You want to talk about family loyalty? I asked, my voice ringing with final absolute victory. Read this. Richard reached out with shaking fingers and opened the folder. He stared at the heavily notarized document inside. It is a signed, sworn, and fully notarized confession from Cameron. I stated, watching the final spark of life extinguish in my father's eyes. In exchange for complete corporate immunity and a promise that I will not press federal charges against him personally, Cameron has formally testified that you and Patricia orchestrated the entire embezzlement scheme. He provided the exact offshore account numbers, the passwords to your hidden ledgers, and a detailed timeline of how you both stole from your clients to fund his lifestyle. He completely threw you under the bus to save his own skin. Your golden boy sold you out for a get-out-of-jail-free card. Richard's eyes tracked back and forth across the crisp white paper, his pupils darting wildly, as if trying to physically outrun the ink on the page. He read Cameron's signature. He read the notary seal. He read the explicit, meticulously detailed paragraphs where his only son, the boy he had sacrificed his own daughter to protect, outlined exactly how Richard had manipulated client escrow accounts. Patricia leaned over his shoulder, her manicured fingers digging into the expensive fabric of his suit jacket to brace herself. Her lips moved silently as she read the sworn testimony. Cameron had not held back. He had detailed Patricia's direct involvement in laundering the stolen funds through fake charitable foundations to maintain her high society profile. A sound tore from Patricia's throat. It was not a gasp or a cry. It was a visceral, jagged shriek of absolute, incomprehensible betrayal. She snatched the manila folder directly out of Richard's hands, tearing the corner of the heavy paper in her frantic haste. Her eyes widened, her chest heaving as she read the lines again and again, desperately searching for a loophole. A sign of forgery, anything to prove that her perfect universe had not just imploded. This is a lie, Patricia screamed, throwing the folder back onto my obsidian desk, as if it were burning her skin. Cameron would never do this. He loves us. He is loyal to this family. You forced him to write this, Savannah. You tortured him or threatened him into signing some piece of garbage fabricated by your lawyers. Richard did not join her denial. The fight had completely drained out of his body, leaving a hollow, hyperventilating shell. He stared at the floor, his hands gripping his knees so hard his knuckles turned white. He knew exactly what Cameron was capable of. He knew the depths of his son's cowardice, because he had cultivated it himself. "Stop screaming, Patricia!" Richard rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves crushed underfoot. "It is real. Those are the exact routing numbers. Those are the exact dates of the transfers. Only Cameron knew that information. Only Cameron had the access codes I gave him when he needed cash for his bookies. He sold us out." Patricia spun around to face her husband, her eyes blazing with an entirely new, terrifying kind of fury. The elegant, poised country club matriarch vanished entirely. She looked feral. "He sold you out." Patricia spat, her voice echoing sharply against the glass walls of my office. "You were the one who made the transfers. You were the one who moved the money from the client accounts. I had nothing to do with the actual mechanics of the theft. I am a victim of your financial mismanagement." Richard snapped his head up, his bloodshot eyes locking onto his wife with pure, unadulterated hatred. The illusion of their unified, flawless marriage detonated right there in the center of my executive suite. "You are a victim!" Richard roared, surging up from the leather guest chair. The sudden violence of his movement made Patricia stumble backward. "You absolute parasite! I embezzled that money to keep you from drowning us. You spent $2 million a year maintaining a lifestyle we could not afford a decade ago. You needed the trips to Milan. You needed the summer home in the Hamptons. You needed to host $100,000 charity galas so your pathetic little friends would think you were royalty." "I was maintaining the family image," Patricia screamed back, her face flushing a dangerous crimson. "I was networking. I was bringing in the exact wealthy clients that you subsequently robbed blind because you are an incompetent businessman. Do not you dare blame me for your lack of corporate success. You were always a weak, pathetic excuse for an executive. My father told me not to marry you. He knew you were a fraud from the day you met." Evelyn stood completely still by the frosted glass doors, her arms folded, watching the destruction with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. I remained seated in my high-backed leather chair, my hands steepled under my chin. I did not say a word. I did not need to. The people who had spent my entire life calling me a violent, unstable failure were currently tearing each other apart with the viciousness of starving wolves. "I stole to pay for your vanity," Richard snarled, stepping into Patricia's personal space, his finger pointing directly at her face. "I risked federal prison every single day to make sure Cameron did not end up in a ditch with broken kneecaps and to make sure your credit cards did not bounce at Neiman Marcus. And what did I get for it? I got a wife who slept with my senior vice president for 3 years while I was killing myself to cover up our debts." Patricia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, genuinely shocked that he knew. "You think I did not know about Marcus?" Richard laughed, a harsh barking sound completely devoid of humor. "You think I did not know you were using the company expense account to book hotel rooms downtown while I was dealing with SEC auditors? I kept my mouth shut because I needed the facade of this marriage just as much as you did to keep the clients from getting suspicious. We built a life on a foundation of your lies and your vanity." "You hypocrite!" Patricia shrieked, recovering from the shock and launching right back into the attack. "You want to talk about infidelity? You want to talk about the apartment you rented for your 25-year-old paralegal? You paid her rent from the corporate escrow account. You bought her a Mercedes while telling me we needed to downsize the household staff. Do not stand there and play the victim, Richard. You are a disgusting, greedy old man who got caught, and now you want to drag me down into the mud with you." The air in the room was toxic, heavy with 15 years of suppressed rage, hidden affairs, and mutual resentment. They screamed at each other, their voices bouncing off the modern architecture of my office, airing every dirty, buried secret they had fought so desperately to hide from high society. They fought about stolen money. They fought about Cameron's drug habits that they had paid private clinics to cover up. They fought about the fraudulent tax returns Patricia had knowingly signed. They completely forgot that I was in the room, They forgot about Evelyn. They forgot about the lawsuit sitting on my desk. They were entirely consumed by their need to destroy one another, desperately trying to assign blame before the federal authorities arrived to tear their lives down to the studs. I sat back and watched them. This was the monster that had haunted my childhood. This was the terrifying, omnipotent authority that had thrown me onto the freezing streets of Chicago with $200 and a ruined name. For years I had feared them. For years I had believed their narrative that I was the broken one, the defective child who could not fit into their pristine, perfect world. But looking at them now, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold clinical disgust. They were not powerful. They were not untouchable. They were just two pathetic, deeply insecure criminals fighting over the scraps of a lie they had told themselves for 3 decades. They had sold their souls for country club memberships and luxury cars, and now they were left with absolutely nothing. "You are going to prison, Richard," Patricia sneered, her voice hoarse from screaming. "And I am going to make sure the judge knows exactly how you coerced me into signing those documents. I will divorce you before the sun goes down. I will take whatever assets are left, and I will leave you to rot." "There are no assets left, you stupid woman," Richard yelled back, his face purple with rage. Savannah took the company. Cameron gave her the offshore accounts. "The bank is going to foreclose on the house by the end of the week. We have nothing. You are going to be standing in the soup line right next to me." They glared at each other, chest heaving, the reality of their mutual destruction finally taking hold. The silence returned to the office, heavy and suffocating. They slowly turned their heads, their bloodshot, panicked eyes finding me sitting calmly behind my desk. They looked at me as if hoping I would intervene, hoping I would step in and offer some kind of resolution to the nightmare they had created. I did not offer a resolution. I let the silence stretch for another 10 seconds, allowing them to feel the absolute crushing weight of their total defeat. I finally stood up. I moved with slow, deliberate precision, straightening the lapels of my tailored blazer. I looked from Richard's defeated, ruined posture to Patricia's tear-stained, terrified face. "I didn't bring you all here today to negotiate a settlement," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute terrifying finality. "I brought you here to keep you in one place." I pressed a silver button on my desk intercom. I removed my finger from the silver intercom button on my desk and folded my hands neatly in front of me. The heavy frosted glass doors of my executive suite slid open instantly on their frictionless tracks. 4 individuals strode into the room. They did not wear the expensive tailored Italian suits favored by Richard and his cronies. They wore utilitarian dark suits and navy windbreakers adorned with the stark, bold yellow lettering of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Heavy gold badges hung from thick chains around their necks, catching the morning sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Richard spun around, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute unadulterated horror as the agents fanned out, instantly blocking every possible exit from the office. The air in the room seemed to vanish entirely. The illusion of his power, the protective bubble of high society and corporate intimidation that had shielded him his entire life, popped in a single second. Richard Sterling, the lead FBI agent, announced, his voice a flat, uncompromising baritone that left zero room for negotiation. "You are under arrest for grand larceny, wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the fabrication of fraudulent legal documents." Panic, raw and completely unfiltered, finally overrode whatever remained of my father's rational mind. He let out a strange, guttural noise and lunged away from the desk. He did not run toward the main doors. He bolted toward the private side exit of my suite, moving with a desperate, clumsy speed fueled entirely by adrenaline and terror. He genuinely believed, even in this final, absolute checkmate, that he could simply physically walk away from the consequences of his actions. He made it exactly 3 steps. 2 agents moved with terrifying practiced efficiency. One grabbed Richard by the shoulder of his custom-tailored suit jacket, spinning him around forcefully, while the other swept his legs out from under him. Richard hit the polished hardwood floor with a heavy, unceremonious thud. He thrashed wildly, screaming obscenities, his face pressed painfully against the floorboards as the agents pinned his arms firmly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoing through the quiet office sounded like a heavy steel vault door slamming shut forever. Just as Richard was being hauled roughly back to his feet, his face red and contorted in agony, the main glass doors opened again. My head of corporate security stepped into the office, firmly gripping Cameron by the bicep. My brother looked completely disheveled and ruined. His silk tie was missing, his designer shirt was wrinkled and stained with sweat, and his face was slick with terrified perspiration. He had been sitting in a downstairs holding room for the past 12 hours, utterly convinced that his signed confession had bought his absolute freedom. When Cameron saw the federal agents and his father standing in handcuffs, his knees simply gave out. He sagged heavily against the security guard, his eyes darting frantically toward me. "Savannah, what is this?" Cameron shrieked, his voice cracking into a pathetic high-pitched whine that echoed off the glass walls. "You said I was immune. You promised me corporate immunity if I signed the confession and gave you the offshore account numbers. We had a deal. Tell them to let me go right now." I remained seated behind my obsidian desk, watching my brother's cowardly display with cold clinical detachment. "I did give you corporate immunity, Cameron," I replied, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any sympathy. "I gave you a legally binding guarantee that Vanguard Acquisitions would not pursue civil litigation against you for your role in attempting to steal our proprietary data. I kept my word. My firm is not suing you." Cameron blinked rapidly, his mouth hanging open in profound confusion as he struggled to process the information. "Then why are the federal agents here?" The lead SEC agent stepped forward, pulling a heavy pair of handcuffs from his tactical belt. "Because the proprietary financial data you attempted to steal from Vanguard Acquisitions was stored on secured servers located across state lines," the agent explained, his tone completely flat and unimpressed. "When you initiated the unauthorized digital transfer of those highly classified files to your father's wealth management firm, you committed federal wire fraud. Your sister does not have the legal authority to grant you immunity from the United States government. Put your hands behind your back." Cameron burst into loud, hysterical tears. He thrashed against the security guard, sobbing uncontrollably like a petulant child as the federal agent wrenched his arms backward and locked the steel cuffs tightly around his wrists. He begged me to help him. He begged the agents to reconsider the charges. He even begged Richard to take the full blame for the wire fraud, completely oblivious to the fact that his father was already staring down the barrel of a 20-year federal prison sentence. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my blazer, and watched the two men who had tormented me, mocked me, and stolen my future standing side by side in matching steel bracelets. The poetic justice of the moment was profound and absolute. "You set us up." Richard spat, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of hatred and total defeat as he glared at me across the room. "You planned every single second of this from the very beginning. I simply gave you exactly enough rope to hang yourselves," I stated, walking slowly around the edge of my desk to stand directly in front of them. "You thought you could intimidate me. You thought I was still the terrified 20-year-old girl you threw out onto the freezing streets. So I let you believe you had the upper hand. I let you think you were winning." I crossed my arms, looking from my father's ruined face to my brother's weeping eyes. "The moment Cameron attempted to hack into my servers yesterday, my cybersecurity team flagged the intrusion instantly," I explained, laying out the precise mechanics of their destruction. "I let him pull just enough encrypted data to trigger a federal offense before completely locking him out of the system. Then when you both panicked and tried to cover your tracks, I simply gathered the evidence. I took the master ledgers detailing 15 years of your continuous embezzlement. I took the audio recording of Patricia confessing to extortion and evidence fabrication in my cloakroom. I took the laughably forged will you confidently brought into my office this morning. I packaged every single piece of undeniable, irrefutable proof, and I handed it directly to the local field offices of the FBI and the SEC at 6 o'clock this morning." Richard's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. He realized finally and entirely the sheer inescapable magnitude of the trap I had built around him. I had not just beaten him in the boardroom. I had systematically dismantled his entire life, ensuring that no expensive lawyer, no high society connection, and no amount of bullying could ever save him from the consequences of his own greed. "Take them out," I instructed the federal agents, turning my back on my father and brother. I have a company to run. The agents did not hesitate. They grabbed Richard and Cameron by the arms and marched them forcefully toward the exit. The heavy frosted glass doors slid open, and my father and brother were paraded out into the main executive lobby. The entire corporate floor had ground to a complete halt. Dozens of my top executives, financial analysts, and administrative staff stood in total silence, watching through the glass walls as the great Richard, a man who had built a glittering empire on lies and intimidation, was frog-marched toward the elevators in handcuffs. Cameron stumbled blindly alongside him, weeping loudly, his face buried in his chest, to hide from the piercing stares of my employees. The polished steel doors of the elevator chimed, opened and swallowed them whole, plunging them down to the street level, where the local news vans and hungry journalists were undoubtedly already waiting. I turned slowly back toward the center of my office. Patricia was still standing exactly where she had been when the agents first breached the room. She was completely isolated. The chaotic, noisy violence of the arrests had swirled around her, leaving her physically untouched, but entirely destroyed. She was clutching her heavily beaded designer purse against her chest so tightly her knuckles were stark white. Her breath came in shallow, rapid, terrified gasps, and her eyes were wide, unblinking pools of pure, concentrated panic. The glittering illusion she had spent her entire life cultivating was permanently gone. The exclusive country club memberships, the lavish charity galas, the extravagant shopping sprees in Milan, and the summers in the Hamptons had evaporated in the span of 5 brutal minutes. She knew the absolute reality of federal indictments. She knew that the SEC had already moved to freeze every single joint bank account, every offshore trust, and every investment portfolio attached to Richard's name. She knew that the massive suburban mansion she prized above all else would be seized by the government to pay restitution to the countless clients Richard had robbed blind. She was utterly and completely destitute. She had no job skills, no savings of her own, and a reputation that had just been publicly annihilated. The high society friends she had spent decades desperately trying to impress would drop her the moment the evening news aired, treating her like a toxic contagion. She had absolutely nothing and no one left to manipulate. Patricia looked at the empty doorway where her husband and her golden child son had just been dragged away in disgrace. Then slowly, painfully, she turned her gaze to me. I stood perfectly still, watching the rapid, desperate calculations firing behind her panicked eyes. She realized in that exact moment that the daughter she had gleefully discarded, the daughter she had framed and cast out into the freezing Chicago winter with nothing but a bus pass, was now the only person on the entire planet who possessed the resources to save her. Patricia's knees violently buckled. She collapsed onto the expensive wool rug covering my office floor. The elegant, domineering matriarch vanished completely, leaving behind a pathetic, broken shell of a woman. She dropped her designer purse, ignoring it as it spilled open on the floor, scattering her expensive cosmetics. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, reaching out and grasping the hem of my tailored slacks with trembling, desperate fingers. "Savannah, please," Patricia sobbed, looking up at me with a face entirely contorted by sheer terror and desperation. "They took everything. My credit cards are declined. The bank called me this morning and said my accounts are completely locked. I have absolutely nowhere to go. My friends will not answer my phone calls. Please, I am begging you on my knees. You are my daughter. You cannot leave me on the street. I have nothing. Please, Savannah, just let me stay with you. Please give me a place to stay." Patricia's fingers dug fiercely into the charcoal wool of my slacks. She looked up at me through a mask of running mascara and profound despair. The woman who had spent 33 years demanding my absolute submission was reduced to a groveling spectacle. She wept with ragged gasps, her chest heaving as she tightened her desperate grip around my ankles. "Savannah, please, I am your mother," she cried out, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of her sudden poverty. "I have absolutely nowhere else to go. Everyone will turn their backs on me. You are the only one left. Please, I am begging you, just give me a room. Just a small room in your house. I will stay out of your way. I will do whatever you want." I stood perfectly motionless, staring down at the woman who had happily allowed my father to frame me for grand larceny. I looked at the woman who watched me being thrown out into a freezing Chicago blizzard with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes, feeling absolutely zero maternal remorse. Even now, completely defeated, she genuinely expected me to fold. She expected the deeply ingrained weakness of an abused daughter to override my cold logic. She believed the biological title of mother would act as a magical shield against the consequences of her behavior. She thought my empathy was a weakness she could exploit. I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer. My fingers brushed against the smooth paper I had deliberately placed there earlier this morning, perfectly anticipating this exact moment. I withdrew two crisp, unwrinkled $100 bills. I held them delicately between my index and middle fingers, letting the green paper catch the ambient light of the boardroom. Patricia's tear-filled eyes instantly tracked the money, a flicker of desperate, greedy hope replacing the stark terror on her face. She reached a trembling hand upward, genuinely believing I was offering her a financial lifeline to secure a luxury hotel room for the night. I opened my fingers and let the bills flutter down through the silent air. They landed directly on her knees, stark and insulting against the floor. "That is the exact amount you gave me when you threw me out into the street," I stated, my voice as cold and smooth as glacial ice. "Call an Uber." Patricia froze entirely, staring blankly at the $200 resting on her lap. The absolute finality of my words struck her with the devastating force of a physical blow. A fresh, agonizing wail tore from her throat, echoing off the glass walls, but I did not stay to listen to it. I turned my back on her and walked toward the frosted doors of my executive suite. I did not look over my shoulder. I did not hesitate. I left Patricia kneeling on the floor of my empire, surrounded by the shattered ruins of her own. Evelyn fell into step right beside me as we walked swiftly down the pristine corporate corridor. Her titanium briefcase swung rhythmically at her side, her expression displaying a look of supreme, calculated satisfaction. We stepped into the private executive elevator together. The polished steel doors slid shut instantly, cutting off the distant pathetic sounds of Patricia's hysterical sobbing. The rapid descent to the ground floor felt entirely different from any elevator ride I had ever taken in my life. The heavy, suffocating pressure that had lived inside my chest for over a decade began to dissolve completely with every passing floor. The lingering ghost of the frightened, discarded 20-year-old girl who had spent her nights sleeping in bus terminals finally evaporated into nothingness. I felt completely unburdened, light, and untouchable. I walked across the expansive, echoing marble lobby of Vanguard Acquisitions. The security guards nodded respectfully as I passed, their posture strictly professional. I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped out into the bustling Chicago afternoon. The bright city sunlight hit my face, warm, golden, and blindingly pure. The crisp wind rolling off Lake Michigan felt incredibly clean, instantly sweeping away the lingering toxicity of the boardroom confrontation. A sleek, black town car was idling quietly at the curb. The heavy rear door opened, and Elias stepped out onto the pavement. My fiancé wore a sharp navy suit, his dark eyes instantly searching my face for any sign of lingering distress or hesitation. When he saw the profound, absolute peace radiating from my posture, his tense shoulders finally relaxed. He smiled, a warm, fiercely protective expression that reached all the way to his eyes, and opened his arms. I stepped directly into his embrace, breathing in the deeply familiar, comforting scent of cedar and sandalwood. He wrapped his arms around me, securely, grounding me in the present reality of the beautiful, authentic life we had built together. "It is done," I murmured against his shoulder, letting out a long, shuddering sigh of pure relief. "It is completely over." Elias kissed the top of my head and held me even tighter against his chest. "I am so incredibly proud of you," he whispered softly. "Now let us go celebrate. Your real family is waiting for you." An hour later, I sat at the head of a grand table inside a private dining room overlooking the river, Elias resting his warm hand comfortably over mine. The conversation flowed effortlessly around me, filled with genuine laughter, shared nostalgic memories, and an unbreakable sense of deep mutual respect. These were the brilliant, dedicated people who believed in my wild vision when Vanguard Acquisitions was nothing but a handwritten business plan sketched out on cheap diner napkins. They wiped away my exhausted tears when the corporate stress seemed utterly insurmountable. They were not bound to me by the random lottery of biology, but by deliberate choice, by unwavering loyalty, and by years of shared sacrifice. There were no hidden agendas here, no calculating glances, no passive-aggressive insults disguised as helpful advice, and no weaponized guilt. This was my actual chosen family. As I looked around the room at the authentic faces of the people I loved, a profound realization settled over my consciousness. For years, a small, deeply damaged part of my psyche had secretly believed my parents' relentless narrative that I was a failure because I did not graduate from their preferred university, because I refused to fit their narrow definition of success, and because I could never secure their highly transactional affection. But my intrinsic worth was never tied to a printed piece of paper from an elite university. It was never tied to the forced approval of people fundamentally incapable of experiencing genuine love. My worth was forged in the blistering fire of my own resilience. I had been handed a brutal life sentence of crushing poverty by the exact people who were supposed to protect me, and I systematically used the heavy bricks they threw at me to build an impenetrable fortress. They had called me a worthless dropout. They had loudly branded me a public embarrassment. They had eagerly diagnosed me as socially unfit, mentally unstable, and financially reckless. They had done everything in their considerable power to ensure I would spend the rest of my natural life crawling blindly through the dirt, begging for scraps of their attention. Instead, I quietly purchased their entire fabricated reality and violently liquidated it. I deliberately triggered the devastating federal investigations that would ensure they could never financially exploit or mentally abuse another innocent person again. I effectively broken the toxic generational curse of narcissistic abuse by simply refusing to participate in their sick game any longer. I completely removed their power to hurt me. I raised my tall glass of vintage champagne, the expensive crystal catching the warm ambient light of the restaurant chandelier. The loyal people gathered around the table immediately raised their glasses in perfect unison, their eyes fixed firmly on me with unwavering pride and profound respect. I smiled back at them, feeling the absolute triumphant certainty of a woman who had successfully conquered her darkest demons and rightfully claimed her throne. I had meticulously built a corporate empire so impossibly high that the people who had desperately tried to bury me could never ever reach me again. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us are the ones we need the most protection from. Savannah's journey teaches us a profound lesson about the true nature of family self-worth and resilience. We are often conditioned to believe that blood ties demand unconditional loyalty, even when that loyalty is met with systemic abuse, manipulation, and betrayal. But Savannah's story shatters that toxic illusion, proving that you do not owe your life, your success, or your peace of mind to the people who actively try to destroy you. True value is not determined by the approval of those who cannot see beyond their own ego and greed. When her family threw her onto the freezing streets with nothing but $200 and a fabricated reputation, they expected her to eventually crumble into submission. Instead, she used the very stones they threw at her to build an impenetrable empire. She teaches us that rock bottom can be the ultimate foundation for a magnificent life. You do not have to negotiate with your abusers, nor do you have to accept their weaponized guilt. True healing often requires walking away from the table entirely and closing the door on the heavy facade of the perfect family. You always have the power to choose your true family. They are the people who celebrate your victories, support you in your darkest hours, and love you without conditions or hidden agendas. By refusing to play their twisted games, you break the generational curse. You can build your life so incredibly high that the toxicity of your past can never reach you again. Share your own story in the comments below about a time you had to walk away from negativity to protect your peace. If Savannah's journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of ultimate resilience and triumph. Remember, your worth is defined by you, not by the people who failed to love you.